Simon Peter, the fisherman who denied his Lord 3 times, sat down some 30 years later with a pen in his hand and began to write a letter about how to suffer well. Think carefully about that sentence, because everything we are going to do together over the next several hours depends on it. The man who could not stand firm for one night in a courtyard, warming his hands at a stranger's fire, while a servant girl asked him a simple question, became the man who taught the whole church how to stand firm under an empire. And the 42 teachings we are going to walk through today came out of that transformation, not out of theory, not out of a comfortable study with a view of the sea. Out of a life that failed publicly, was restored personally, and then poured itself out completely. He was born Simon, son of Jonah. He worked the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee with his brother Andrew, hauling nets in the dark hours before dawn, because that is when the fish rise in those waters, and that is when fishermen work. His hands were ruined by rope and salt. His speech carried the accent of Galilee so thickly that strangers could identify where he was from within a sentence or two, which is exactly what happened on the worst night of his life. He was not educated in the rabbinical schools. He had no standing in Jerusalem. He was, by every measure that the religious establishment of his day used to evaluate a man, entirely unremarkable. And Jesus looked at him and said, "You will be called Cephas, the rock." Nothing in Simon's life at that moment justified the name. He was not solid. He was not steady. He was, if we are honest about what the Gospels actually record, one of the most volatile personalities in the New Testament. He was the man who walked on water and then sank, the man who confessed Christ as the Son of the living God in one breath and was rebuked as a mouthpiece of the adversary a few verses later. The man who swore he would die before he denied, and then denied 3 times before the rooster finished announcing the morning. The man who drew a sword in a garden and cut off a servant's ear because he did not yet understand what kind of kingdom he had joined. The man who ran to the empty tomb, went inside, saw the folded grave clothes, and walked away confused. The man who, after the resurrection, went back to fishing because he did not know what else to do with himself. That is the man who wrote these letters. That is the man whose teachings we're going to sit with today, and that fact alone should change how you hear every single word that follows. Because when Peter tells you to cast all your anxiety on God, he is not a man who has never been anxious. When Peter tells you not to be surprised at the fiery trial that comes to test you, he is writing from inside a persecution that would eventually kill him. When Peter tells you that God gives grace to the humble, he is a man who learned humility the hard way, in the most humiliating manner possible, in front of witnesses, on the record, in a story that would be read aloud in churches for 2,000 years. Peter never got to hide his failure. It is in all 4 Gospels. He could not spin it, minimize it, or quietly leave it out of his testimony, and somehow that man became the rock. 42 teachings. We chose that number deliberately and not arbitrarily. Peter's 2 letters and his recorded preaching contain far more than 42 individual statements, but there are 42 distinct, load-bearing teachings, 42 structural beams that together hold up the entire house of the Christian life as Peter understood it. Take any one of them out and something sags. They cover how to think, how to suffer, how to hope, how to speak, how to marry, how to work, how to lead, how to resist, how to endure, and how to wait. They cover the interior life and the public life. They cover the ordinary Tuesday and the worst night of your life. Peter was writing to people scattered across 5 Roman provinces in what is now Turkey. Believers who had been pushed out of their towns, cut off from their trades, slandered by their neighbors, and in some cases, arrested. He was writing to people whose faith was costing them something real, and he was writing to tell them, in essence, this is not evidence that God has abandoned you. This is exactly what following a crucified and risen Lord looks like from the inside. This is not a study about ancient history, though history runs underneath every line, and we will stop to look at it whenever it opens the meaning of the text. This is not an academic lecture on the epistles of Peter, though there is real theology here, and we are not going to skip past it or water it down. This is something closer to a long conversation with a man who has been where you are, who was afraid, who failed badly, who was restored completely, and who spent the rest of his life trying to hand what he received to everyone he could reach before his time ran out. We are going to take these 42 teachings slowly. We are not going to rush. We are not going to give you a tidy list of principles and a memorable acronym and send you on your way. We are going to sit with the text. We are going to look at the words Peter chose in the Greek when the choice matters. We are going to follow the argument where it goes. We are going to let the weight of it accumulate the way Peter intended, layer upon layer, until what you are left with at the end is not merely information about the Christian life, but something closer to a settled and unshakable conviction about it. Because that is what these letters do. Read carefully. They do not just inform you. They steady you. Before we go any further, we want to ask you for one thing, and only one thing. If this channel has been a place where you have found something real, a truth you needed, a moment of quiet, a word that arrived at exactly the right hour, please subscribe. That is the whole ask. It costs nothing at all. It is completely free, and it takes a single tap. The subscribe button just below this video, and that is all there is to it. We say this plainly because we would rather be honest than clever. If you do not subscribe, you will drift. The next teaching will be released and the one after that, and you will not be here for them. Not because you decided to leave, but simply because the internet is loud and things get lost. Subscribing is how you keep your seat. It is how this becomes a steady place you return to each week, rather than a video you happen to find once. And before we begin, we would love it if you left a single word in the comments, just one, for what you are carrying into this teaching today. Not a paragraph, not an explanation. One word for the weight you are hoping to set down over the next few hours. Grief, fear, debt, waiting, shame. Whatever it honestly is, there is something powerful about naming a thing plainly, and something more powerful still about naming it in a room full of people who are naming theirs at the same time. Now, with our hearts turned toward the text and our expectations set on the God who still speaks through it, let us begin. Teaching 1, born again to a living hope, the foundation beneath everything else. 1 Peter 1:3. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, which according to his abundant mercy hath begotten us again unto a lively hope by the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. Peter opens his first letter to a scattered and suffering church, and the very first thing he does is not to address their circumstances. He does not begin with sympathy. He does not begin with strategy. He begins with worship. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. This is not avoidance. This is architecture. Peter knows that if you begin with the problem defines the conversation. If you begin with God, God defines the conversation, and the problem is relocated to its proper size. Every one of the 41 teachings that follow this one is built on the foundation laid in these opening lines. Get this wrong, and everything above it leans. Notice the word Peter attaches to hope. He does not say a strong hope, or a reasonable hope, or a hope worth trying. He says a living hope. In the Greek, it is a present participle, a hope that is alive, actively living, ongoing. Peter is drawing a deliberate contrast with the kind of hope that most human beings actually run on, which is a hope that is technically still breathing, but is not really alive. The hope that the diagnosis will improve, the hope that the marriage will turn around, the hope that the finances will recover. These hopes are real, and they are not wrong to hold, but they are mortal. They can die. Most of us have buried several of them already, and we know exactly what that feels like. And part of the weariness we carry is the weariness of a person who has hoped and been disappointed enough times that they have begun to be careful about hoping again. Peter says there is a hope that cannot die, and he tells you precisely why: by the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. The hope is alive because the object of the hope is alive. That is the entire logic. Christian hope is not optimism. Optimism is a temperament. Some people are born with more of it than others, and it can be worn down by hard years until there is very little left. Christian hope is not a temperament at all. It is a conclusion drawn from an event. Something happened outside Jerusalem on a Sunday morning, and if that thing happened, then the last enemy has already been defeated in public, and everything else follows. And notice how you came to have this hope. Peter says God has begotten us again. You did not manufacture it. You did not decide one day to be more hopeful and generate this from your own interior resources. You were born again into it. And the language of birth is important because nobody arranges their own birth. A baby does not contribute to its own delivery. It is carried, and then it is brought forth, and then it opens its eyes on a world it did nothing to enter. Peter wants you to understand that your standing in this hope is not the result of your spiritual effort. It is the result of God's abundant mercy. And the word abundant here carries the sense of great quantity, of much, of more than was required. Which means practically this: on the day when your feelings about God are cold, when your prayers feel like they are hitting a ceiling, when you cannot summon a single ounce of enthusiasm for the things of faith, the hope you have is still living. It is not living because you feel it. It is living because Christ is not in the tomb. Your emotions are weather. The resurrection is climate. And Peter starts here because everything he is about to ask of you, the holiness, the endurance, the humility, the patience under unjust suffering, is impossible for a person who is not standing on ground that will hold. So begin here, not with what you can feel today, but with what is true today. He is risen. Therefore the hope is alive. Therefore you are not building on sand. Teaching too, an inheritance reserved in heaven, what cannot be taken from you. 1 Peter 1:4-5. To an inheritance incorruptible and undefiled, and that fadeth not away, reserved in heaven for you, who are kept by the power of God, through faith unto salvation, ready to be revealed in the last time. Peter has just told his readers that they have a living hope. Now he tells them what that hope is actually attached to, and he does it with 3 adjectives that would have landed hard on the people receiving this letter, because every one of them describes something these believers had already lost in the visible world. Incorruptible. The Greek word is aphthartos, and it means not subject to decay, immune to the process of rot. Everything in the material world is subject to entropy. Iron rusts, wood rots, bodies age. The house you maintain requires maintenance precisely because it is dying slowly, and the moment you stop working on it, the decay becomes visible. Peter says your inheritance is not part of that system. Undefiled. The word is amiantos, meaning unstained, unpolluted, untouched by anything that would spoil it. Nothing has been mixed into it. No corruption has gotten in. In a world where nearly everything good is contaminated by something, the promotion that came with a compromise, the relationship that carries an old wound, the church that has a history you would rather not know, Peter says here is a thing with nothing wrong in it at all, that fadeth not away. The word is amaranthos, a word borrowed from the world of flowers. It refers to a bloom that does not wither, Peter is a man who has watched the wildflowers of Galilee explode across the hillsides in spring and then vanish under the summer heat within weeks. He knows how fast beauty goes. He says, "Not this," and then the phrase that carries the emotional weight, "reserved in heaven for you." The verb is in the perfect tense, which in Greek describes a completed action with ongoing results. It has been reserved, and it stays reserved. It is a word used for something set aside and guarded, held under watch. Your name is on it. It is not in a general fund that may or may not be distributed. It has been kept, and it is being kept. Remember who is reading this. These are people who have lost property, who have been driven out of towns where their families had lived for generations, who have had trade guilds close to them because those guilds required participation in pagan rites they could no longer perform. Some of them had lost inheritances in the literal legal sense, disowned by families who considered their new faith a betrayal of everything the household stood for. Peter writes to people who have watched their earthly inheritance evaporate and says, "There is another one, and it is in a location where none of the forces that took the first one can operate." Then he turns it around. Not only is the inheritance kept for you, you are kept for the inheritance, who are kept by the power of God through faith. The word translated kept is a military term, frurio, meaning to guard with a garrison, to protect with soldiers posted around a city. Peter is not describing a passive safekeeping. He is describing a fortified position. There is a garrison around you, and it is not made of your resolve. This matters more than it may first appear. Many believers can accept that heaven is secure and still lie awake at night, afraid that they themselves are not, afraid that they will drift or fail or wake up one day and find they no longer believe, and that the inheritance will be there, but they will not be. Peter closes that gap in a single clause. The same power that guards the inheritance guards the heir. Through faith, he adds, which is not a loophole, but a description of the channel. Faith is not the power. Faith is the hand that holds on to the power, and even that hand is being held. Teaching 3. Trials as refining fire. Why the furnace is not punishment. First, Peter 1:6-7. Wherein ye greatly rejoice, though now for a season, if need be, ye are in heaviness through manifold temptations, that the trial of your faith, being much more precious than of gold that perisheth, though it be tried with fire, might be found unto praise and honor and glory at the appearing of Jesus Christ. Here is where Peter turns to face the thing his readers are actually living through, and the care with which he does it is worth noticing before we look at what he says. He does not tell them they should not be sad. He says plainly that they are in heaviness. The Greek word describes real grief, real distress, being made sorrowful. Peter validates the pain before he interprets it. That order matters. A great deal of shallow teaching about suffering skips the validation and goes straight to the interpretation, which is how you end up with a Christianity that requires people to pretend. Peter does not require anyone to pretend. He assumes the grief is real and then tells them something true about it. He also puts a boundary around it, for a season. In the Greek, briefly, for a little while, Peter is not minimizing the suffering by calling it short. He is locating it. He is telling people who cannot see an end to their circumstances that an end exists, whether or not they can see it from where they are standing. Suffering with a horizon is a fundamentally different experience from suffering without one, even when the pain is identical, because the human soul can endure almost anything it knows will finish. And then he says, if need be. Those 3 words are among the most pastorally significant in the letter. Peter is not saying that all suffering is sent, or that every hard thing has been engineered for your improvement. He is saying that when the trial comes, it is not outside the scope of God's purpose, and it is not more than what is necessary. There is a limit, and the limit is set by need, not by cruelty, not by indifference, and not by chance. Then comes the metaphor. Gold is refined by fire. Peter's readers understood this process better than we do, because in the ancient world, refining was a visible trade. Ore was heated until it liquefied, and the impurities, the dross, rose to the surface where the refiner skimmed them off. The fire did not destroy the gold. The fire could not destroy the gold. Fire is precisely the thing that gold survives, which is exactly why fire is the tool used to purify it. What burns away is only what was never gold in the first place. Understand what this means for you. The fire is not aimed at you. It is aimed at what is in you that is not you. The false confidences, the counterfeit securities, the version of faith that was built on circumstances staying favorable. Those things cannot survive heat, and their inability to survive heat is exactly what makes them worth losing. Most of us do not discover which parts of our faith were structural and which were decorative until something applies pressure. And then Peter says the thing that reframes it entirely. Your faith is much more precious than gold that perishes. Read that slowly. He is not saying faith is like gold. He is saying gold is the lesser thing. Gold is the illustration, not the standard. If a refiner will spend hours at a furnace for a metal that will eventually be lost, melted, stolen, or buried with an empire, how much more attention will God give to the refining of something that will still exist when the sun has burned out? The purpose, Peter says, is that it might be found unto praise and honor and glory at the appearing of Jesus Christ. There is a day coming when what the fire produced will be seen, not by you only, publicly. What is being formed in you in obscurity, in the private hours, in the trials nobody knows the full weight of, is being formed for display on a day when the one who did the refining will hold it up. Teaching 4. Loving whom you have not seen, faith that does not depend on sight. 1 Peter 1, 8-9. Whom, having not seen, ye love, in whom, though now ye see him not, yet believing, ye rejoice with joy unspeakable and full of glory, receiving the end of your faith, even the salvation of your souls. There is something almost startling about this verse when you remember who wrote it. Peter had seen him. Peter had eaten fish with him on a beach. Peter had watched him sleep in a boat during a storm. Peter had seen his face transfigured on a mountain until it shone. Peter had seen the wounds after the resurrection. Of all the people in the first century who could have written about the advantage of having seen Jesus, Peter was near the top of the list, and he writes to people who have never seen him and does not tell them they are at a disadvantage. He tells them their love is real and their joy is real, and he says it without a hint of condescension. This is Peter deliberately handing over what he could have held. He is doing in writing what Jesus did in words to Thomas, "Blessed are they that have not seen and yet have believed." Peter, who had every reason to build his authority on eyewitness privilege, instead builds a bridge across it. He says the thing that happens in you when you love a Christ you have never seen with your eyes is not a lesser version of what happened in him. It is the same thing. Consider what this means practically. A great deal of Christian discouragement comes from a quiet suspicion that the real thing happened to other people, to the apostles who saw, to the great saints who apparently felt things we do not feel, to the person in your church who talks about God the way other people talk about their closest friend. And under that suspicion is the assumption that your faith, which mostly consists of showing up and believing on days when nothing dramatic is occurring, is a thin and second-rate participation in something other people are experiencing fully. Peter says no, whom having not seen ye love. The love is not diminished by the absence of sight. In some ways it is intensified by it, because a love that persists without sensory confirmation is a love that has been proven to be about the person rather than the experience. Then Peter uses a phrase that is difficult to translate and impossible to exaggerate: joy, unspeakable and full of glory. The Greek word is aneklaletos, joy that cannot be spoken out, that language cannot get around. Peter is an eyewitness of the Transfiguration, reaching for words to describe what happens in ordinary believers and finding that he does not have them. That is a remarkable admission from a man who had seen a mountain fill with light. Note also that he says full of glory, literally glorified. The joy Peter describes is not merely intense. It has a quality to it that comes from somewhere else. It is joy with the residue of another world on it. And crucially, it coexists with the heaviness he named 2 verses earlier. Peter is not describing a person who has stopped grieving. He is describing a person who is grieving, and underneath the grief, at a level the grief does not reach, is glad. And the final phrase names the destination, receiving the end of your faith, even the salvation of your souls. The word for end is telos, not termination, but completion. The goal a thing was aiming at all along. Your faith is going somewhere. It is not circling, it is arriving. Teaching 5. Gird up the loins of your mind, thinking as a spiritual discipline. First, Peter 1:13. Wherefore gird up the loins of your mind, be sober, and hope to the end for the grace that is to be brought unto you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Peter has spent 12 verses describing what God has done. Now, for the first time in the letter, he tells his readers to do something. And the first command in the entire letter is a command about the mind. That order is not accidental, and it is worth pausing on. Peter does not open with behavior, he opens with thought. The reason is simple. What you do flows out of what you actually believe, and what you actually believe is determined not by what you would say if asked, but by what your mind is habitually doing when nobody is directing it. Peter goes to the source. The image he uses is vivid and would have been instantly clear to his readers. In the ancient Near East, men wore long, flowing outer garments. Ordinary walking was fine in such a garment, but if you needed to run, or work hard, or fight, the loose fabric would tangle your legs and slow you down. So you would reach down, gather the fabric, pull it up, and tuck it into your belt. Girding up the loins meant getting ready for exertion. It meant no loose material, nothing hanging that can trip you. Peter applies that image to the mind, and the implication is sharp. There is such a thing as a loose mind, a mind with fabric hanging everywhere, a mind that wanders, that consumes whatever is placed in front of it, that has never been gathered up and tucked in, that has no discipline about where it goes when it is left alone. Peter says that kind of mind will trip you, not might, will. Then he adds, be sober. The Greek word nepho means literally to be free from the influence of intoxicants, and figuratively to be clear-headed, self-controlled, not carried away. Peter uses this word 3 times in this letter, here in chapter 4 and again in chapter 5. Which tells you how central it is to his thinking. He's describing a person who is not being swept along, not intoxicated by fear, not intoxicated by outrage, not intoxicated by the endless emotional stimulation available to anyone who wants it. We should be honest about how difficult this is in an age designed to make sobriety of mind nearly impossible. Every economic incentive in the modern information environment is aimed at the opposite of what Peter is asking for. Your attention is valuable precisely to the degree that it can be captured and held, which means the tools you use all day are engineered by people who are extremely good at their jobs to keep your mind ungirded and unsober. Peter's command is not quaint. It is more urgent now than when he wrote it. And notice what he tells the disciplined mind to do. Hope to the end for the grace that is to be brought unto you. The word translated hope is not passive. It is an active setting of expectation. Peter is telling you where to point the mind once you have gathered it up. Not at analysis of your circumstances, not at rehearsing conversations, at the grace that is coming at the revelation of Jesus Christ. This is the discipline, not emptying the mind but aiming it, and it is a discipline precisely because the mind does not do this on its own. Left alone, the mind drifts to threat, it scans for danger, it replays the past and rehearses the future. Peter says, reach down, gather that up, tuck it in and point it forward, every morning and often several times a day. Teaching 6, be holy, for I am holy, the call to belong to God, visibly. First, Peter 1, 15-16. But as he which hath called you is holy, so be ye holy in all manner of conversation, because it is written, be ye holy, for I am holy. Peter reaches back into Leviticus and pulls forward a command that God gave to Israel, and he hands it, without alteration, to a group of mostly Gentile believers scattered across Asia Minor. That move is significant on its own. Peter is telling people who were never under the Mosaic law that the character requirement has not changed because the character of God has not changed. The word holy, hagios in Greek, kadosh in Hebrew, does not primarily mean morally flawless. It means set apart, devoted to a specific purpose and therefore not available for other uses. In the temple, the utensils were holy not because bronze bowls have moral qualities, but because they had been designated for one function and could not be taken home and used for soup. Holiness is fundamentally about belonging and designation. The moral content follows from that, rather than the other way around. This reframes the entire command. Peter is not telling you to try harder to be good. He is telling you to live in a way that is consistent with whom you belong to. The logic is, he which hath called you is holy. Therefore, your holiness is derivative. It is a response to a prior claim on your life, not an achievement that establishes the claim. Notice the phrase in all manner of conversation. In 17th century English, conversation meant far more than speech. It meant your entire manner of life, your conduct, the way you move through the world. And Peter says all manner, not the religious parts, not the visible parts, the way you drive, the way you talk about people who are not in the room, what you do with your evenings, how you handle it when the person behind the counter makes a mistake. Holiness that has a perimeter is not holiness. It is a costume worn in a designated area. We should be careful here because this teaching has been badly damaged in popular use. Holiness has often been reduced to a list of prohibitions, most of them cultural, and the result is a version of the Christian life that is anxious, joyless, and constantly measuring itself against other people. That is not what Peter is describing. He is describing a life that has been claimed, a life whose center of gravity has moved. The prohibitions exist, but they are downstream. They are the natural consequence of a person who now belongs somewhere else. And notice the ground of the command. For I am holy. Peter does not motivate holiness with the fear of loss or the promise of reward. He motivates it with the character of God. This is important because motivations shape the thing they produce. Holiness motivated by fear produces scrupulosity. Holiness motivated by reward produces bargaining. Holiness motivated by the sheer beauty and otherness of God produces worship, and worship is the only engine that runs for a lifetime without breaking down. There is one more thing here worth naming plainly, because it is where most people stumble. Peter is writing to people who fail. He knows they fail. He fails himself spectacularly on the record. The call to holiness is not a claim that you have arrived. It is a direction of travel. The question Peter is asking is not whether you are holy today. It is which way you are facing. Teaching 7, redeemed with precious blood. Knowing what you cost. First, Peter 1:18-19. "Forasmuch as ye know that ye were not redeemed with corruptible things, as silver and gold, from your vain conversation received by tradition from your fathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish and without spot." Peter uses the language of the marketplace here, and specifically the language of the slave market. To redeem, lutru, meant to purchase a person's freedom by paying the price that released them. It was a transaction anyone in the first century would have witnessed. Slaves were bought out of bondage by relatives, patrons, and sometimes by their own accumulated savings. The mechanism was familiar. The price was always money. Peter says, "Not this time. Ye were not redeemed with corruptible things, as silver and gold." And there is a quiet devastation in the word corruptible applied to precious metals. Silver and gold were the most permanent, most trustworthy stores of value the ancient world possessed. Empires were built on them, and Peter categorizes them with everything else that rots. Measured against what he is about to name, the most durable wealth on earth is in the same category as fruit left on a counter. From your vain conversation received by tradition from your fathers. Peter names what they were redeemed from, and it is not merely a list of sins. It is an inherited way of living, empty, futile, handed down. That phrase would have carried real weight for his readers, because in the ancient world, tradition was the highest authority. You did what your fathers did. That was not laziness, it was virtue. And Peter calls it empty. He is telling people that the way of life they inherited, the one everyone around them still considers self-evidently correct, was a form of slavery, and that they have been bought out of it. Then the price, the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish and without spot. Peter, who watched it happen, describes it in sacrificial language. Every Passover lamb for 1,500 years had to be examined and found without defect. The requirement was not ceremonial fussiness. It was a picture, sustained across centuries, of a substitute who had nothing wrong with him. Peter had spent 3 years watching the only person who ever passed that examination. Now consider what this teaching is actually for. Peter does not include it as doctrine for its own sake. He introduces it with "forasmuch as ye know," meaning live in light of what you already know. The knowledge is meant to do something. What it does is this: it settles the question of your worth without flattering you. This is a subtle and important balance. Peter does not say you were redeemed because you were valuable. He says a price was paid, and the price tells you what you are now worth to the one who paid it. Those are different claims. The first makes your value intrinsic and puts the pressure back on you to be worth it. The second makes your value declared, established by an act outside yourself that cannot be revised by your performance. That distinction is the difference between a person who is exhausted by trying to justify their existence and a person who has stopped trying. If the blood of Christ was the price, then no accusation can reprice you, not your worst memory, not the thing you have never told anyone. The transaction is closed. Teaching 8. Love one another fervently, the strenuous work of Christian affection. 1 Peter 1:22. Seeing ye have purified your souls in obeying the truth through the Spirit, unto unfeigned love of the brethren, see that ye love one another with a pure heart fervently. 2 words in this verse carry the whole weight, and both of them are more demanding than English lets on. The first is unfeigned. In Greek, anupokritos, literally unhypocritical without a mask. The word comes from the theater, where actors held masks in front of their faces to play their parts. Peter is asking for love without the mask, which means he is acknowledging, by implication, that masked love is possible and common, that a person can perform warmth toward fellow believers without any of it being real, and can do it well enough that nobody notices, sometimes including themselves. Church is one of the easiest places on earth to perform affection. The vocabulary is available. The gestures are established. You can ask someone how they are doing in a tone that communicates care while hoping the answer is short. Peter is not primarily worried about people who are openly cold toward one another. He is worried about a community full of masks. The second word is fervently. The Greek is ektenos, and it is an athletic term. It describes a muscle stretched to its limit. A runner at full extension, straining. It is not the language of warm feeling. It is the language of effort. Peter is saying, love one another the way a sprinter runs the last 20 meters. Put those two words together and you have Peter's actual instruction. Love without a mask and love at full stretch, which means the love he has in mind is neither performed nor easy. It is real and it is strenuous. This is worth sitting with because it corrects a widespread misunderstanding. Many believers assume that if love requires effort, it must not be genuine, that real affection should arise spontaneously, and that having to work at loving someone in the church is evidence that something has gone wrong. Peter assumes the opposite. He assumes the effort is normal and commands it directly. Think about who was in these congregations. Jews and Gentiles who had been raised to regard each other with suspicion. Slaves and slave owners sitting in the same room, sometimes the same household. Wealthy patrons and day laborers, Roman citizens and people with no legal standing whatsoever. The early church was not a community of people who naturally got along. It was a collection of people who had nothing in common except Christ, and who were now told to love each other at full stretch, without masks. That is an enormous ask, and Peter makes it without apology. He also tells them where the capacity comes from, seeing ye have purified your souls in obeying the truth. The love is downstream of the purification. Something has already happened to them that makes this possible. He is not asking them to generate love out of nothing. He is asking them to spend what has already been deposited. One practical note. If you are waiting to feel fervent before you act fervently, you will wait a long time. Peter puts the command on the action, not the emotion, and the consistent testimony of people who have tried it is that the feeling tends to follow the practice rather than precede it. Serve someone you find difficult quietly and repeatedly, and watch what happens to your heart over a year. Teaching 9. The word that does not wither. Where to stand when everything else gives way. 1 Peter 1:24-25. For all flesh is as grass, and all the glory of man as the flower of grass. The grass withereth, and the flower thereof falleth away, but the word of the Lord endureth forever. Peter quotes Isaiah, and he chooses a passage that Isaiah himself delivered to a people facing exile, a people whose entire national structure was about to be dismantled. The quotation is not decorative. Peter is picking a text that was originally addressed to people watching their world end, and he is handing it to people watching their world end. All flesh is as grass. In the hills of Galilee and Judea, the winter rains bring a startling green across land that is brown most of the year. For a few weeks the hillsides are covered. Then the sirocco arrives, the hot east wind off the desert, and within days the grass is gone, not fading over a season, gone. Anyone who lived in that landscape had watched abundance vanish in under a week, repeatedly every year of their life, and all the glory of man as the flower of grass. Peter does not merely say that human life is brief, he says that the glory of human life is brief. The achievement, the reputation, the standing, the thing you built. It is not only that people die, it is that the impressive things people do die too, and usually sooner than the people who did them. This is not cynicism. Isaiah and Peter are not sour men taking pleasure in the fragility of human effort. They are physicians naming a condition accurately so that the treatment makes sense. Every anxiety you carry is, at some level, an anxiety about the grass, about whether your particular patch of it will hold, about what happens when the wind comes. But the word of the Lord endureth forever. And Peter adds, in the next breath, a clarification that changes the temperature of the whole passage. And this is the word which by the gospel is preached unto you. He is not talking about an abstract eternal principle located somewhere out in the cosmos. He is saying that the thing which outlasts the wind is the very message they have already heard and believed. The permanence is not distant, it has already been handed to them. Consider what this teaching does when it is genuinely believed. It relocates your footing. Most people build their stability on things in the grass category: health, income, relationships, the stability of the society they live in. And this is not foolish, because those things are real and they matter. But they are all in the same category, and the wind comes for all of them eventually. Peter says there is something in a different category, and it is available to stand on right now. There is also a quiet comfort here for people who feel that their own lives are small and unremarkable. If human glory withers anyway, then the difference between an impressive life and an obscure one is smaller than it appears. Both are grass. And what endures is not the size of what you built, but your connection to the word that does not pass away. The obscure believer who has anchored themselves to an eternal word, and the celebrated one who has anchored themselves to their own achievements, are not in the end in the same position, and the obscure one is in the better one. Teaching 10. Lay aside malice and guile, removing what poisons, a community first. Peter 2.1. Wherefore, laying aside all malice and all guile, and hypocrisies, and envies, and all evil speakings, Peter has just commanded fervent, unmasked love. Now he tells his readers what they will have to remove for that love to be possible, and he produces a list of 5 specific things. The list is not random. Every item on it is a sin that damages community from the inside, invisibly, without producing an obvious scandal. Laying aside is the language of clothing. The verb was used for taking off a garment and setting it down. Peter is describing something deliberate and physical, a decision, an action, a thing you take off, not something you wait to be delivered from while it remains on you. All malice. The Greek kakia is a broad word for ill will, the settled desire that something bad should happen to someone. It is quieter than hatred. It is the small, private satisfaction when a person you resent has a setback. Most people would deny carrying malice while carrying a manageable amount of it every day. All guile. Dolos originally meant bait in a trap. It is deceit that operates through indirection. Saying something technically true in order to create a false impression, managing what people know in order to steer them. Guile does not lie outright. It curates. Hypocrisies, the mask again, from the same theatrical root Peter used in the previous verse. Note that he uses the plural. Not hypocrisy as a general condition, but hypocrisies, the specific individual performances a person puts on across different rooms. Envies. Pythanos, the pain felt at another person's good. Envy is unique among sins in that it offers no pleasure at all, not even briefly. Every other sin at least promises something. Envy only corrodes. And it is almost never confessed, because to confess envy, you have to admit that someone else has something you wanted and could not get. All evil speakings. Katalalia, literally speaking against, speaking down about someone. Not lying about them necessarily. Often the content is accurate. The sin is in the direction and the intent. It is the conversation about a person that would end immediately if that person walked into the room. Look at these 5 together and notice what they share. None of them is dramatic. None of them will get anyone removed from a congregation. They can all be practiced for decades by people with a reputation for godliness, and they will hollow out a church more thoroughly than any public sin because they are load-bearing failures in the walls rather than a fire on the roof. Peter's instruction is uncomplicated and hard. Take them off. Not manage them, not moderate them, not wait until you feel differently. Set them down the way you set down a coat when you walk into a warm room. And the reason Peter can command this, rather than merely recommend it, is that he has already told them what they are wearing instead. They have been born again, purified, redeemed at a price. The old garment does not fit the new person. It is not that these things are forbidden. It is that they have become absurd. Teaching 11. Desire the sincere milk of the word, the appetite that reveals the life first. Peter 2:2-3. As newborn babes desire the sincere milk of the word, that ye may grow thereby, if so be ye have tasted that the Lord is gracious. Peter chooses an image that is impossible to sentimentalize if you have ever been near an actual infant at 2 in the morning. He is not describing a gentle preference. A newborn's desire for milk is total, urgent, and unembarrassed. It does not negotiate. It does not wait for a convenient hour. It does not consider whether asking again would be excessive. It simply and loudly requires the one thing it needs, and it will not be consoled by substitutes. That is the appetite Peter is asking for, not a scheduled reading habit, not a disciplined commitment to get through a plan by December. Hunger, the word translated sincere, is adolos, literally without guile. And it is the same root Peter used one verse earlier when he told them to lay aside all guile. That connection is deliberate and easy to miss. In the ancient world, milk sold in markets was routinely watered down or adulterated. Peter is contrasting the pure, undiluted word with everything that has been cut with something else. He is telling a church surrounded by teachers who mix things into the message, "Go to the unadulterated source, that ye may grow thereby." Here is the purpose, and it is worth being clear about what Peter does and does not say. He does not say the word will make you feel better, though it often will. He does not say it will give you answers, though it frequently does. He says it will make you grow. Growth is slow, largely invisible day to day, measurable only over long periods, and it happens whether or not the meal was enjoyable. Nobody remembers the individual meals that built their body. This is one of the most practically useful things in Peter's letter, because it addresses the most common discouragement believers have about Scripture, that they read it and nothing seems to happen. Peter's answer is that something is happening, and that the mechanism is nutritional rather than experiential. A child does not feel themselves growing. They simply eat, and then one day the clothes do not fit. The person who reads the word steadily for a decade without dramatic moments will be a fundamentally different person at the end of that decade, and they will not be able to point to a single meal that did it. Then Peter adds a condition that is easy to read past. If so be ye have tasted that the Lord is gracious. The Greek construction assumes the condition is true, since you have tasted. He is not casting doubt. He is grounding the appetite in an experience they have already had, and that is the key to the whole teaching. Appetite comes from taste. Nobody craves food they have never eaten. The reason a believer hungers for Scripture is that somewhere along the line they encountered God in it and found that He was good, kind, gracious, better than they expected. And now something in them goes looking for that again, which means the honest diagnostic question is not whether you read enough. It is whether you have tasted. If your Bible reading feels like an obligation you keep failing at, the problem may not be discipline. It may be that you have been handling the text as information rather than encountering the person in it. Peter's remedy is not to try harder, it is to taste again. Teaching. 12. Living stones in a living house, you are not meant to stand alone. First, Peter 2:4-5. To whom coming as unto a living stone, disallowed indeed of men, but chosen of God, and precious ye also as lively stones, are built up a spiritual house, an holy priesthood. There is a personal note buried in this image that is almost too quiet to hear. The man writing this is the man Jesus renamed Rock. And here he is, decades later, telling ordinary believers that they are stones too. Peter does not keep the name, he distributes it. The picture is of a building under construction, and Peter begins with the foundation, Christ, the living stone, disallowed indeed of men. The word disallowed means rejected after examination, the term used for a builder inspecting a stone and setting it aside as unsuitable. Peter is describing a considered verdict. The world looked carefully at Jesus and concluded he would not do, and in the same breath, chosen of God and precious. Two examinations, opposite conclusions. The world's assessment and God's assessment of the same stone could not have been further apart. Hold on to that, because it is the interpretive key for everything Peter says about suffering later in the letter. If the world's rejection of the cornerstone was not a reliable measure of his worth, then the world's rejection of you is not a reliable measure of yours. Then ye also, as lively stones, are built up a spiritual house, living stones. It is a deliberate contradiction. Stone is the most inert material in the ancient world, the very definition of lifeless permanence. And Peter attaches life to it. What he means is that this house is not made of material that gets stacked and stays put. It is made of people, and people grow, move, resist, and change shape. But notice the grammar carefully, because it is the point of the whole teaching. Our built up is passive and plural. You do not build yourself, and you are not built into a private structure. A single stone is not a house, it is a rock in a field. Stones become a wall only in contact with other stones, bearing weight and transmitting it. This lands directly on one of the most common assumptions of modern faith, that the essential thing is my personal relationship with God, and the church is optional support for it. Peter would not recognize that idea. In his image, the individual believer is not the building. The individual believer is a component whose function is only realized in connection. A stone that refuses contact has not preserved its independence. It has forfeited its purpose. And then Peter says something that would have stopped his first readers cold: an holy priesthood. In every religious system of the ancient world, priesthood was a restricted class. You qualified by birth or by appointment. Ordinary people did not approach the holy place. They sent someone. Peter tells day laborers, slaves, women, and foreigners scattered across Asia Minor that they are priests, that they have direct access, that they offer sacrifices themselves, that no intermediary stands between them and God. This is one of the most quietly revolutionary sentences in the New Testament. It means that the housewife praying while she works and the fisherman on the water are performing priestly service. There is no upper tier of Christian. There is one priesthood, and if you are in Christ, you are in it. Teaching 13. A chosen generation, a royal priesthood, identity before instruction. 1 Peter 2:9. But ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, an holy nation, a peculiar people, that ye should show forth the praises of him who hath called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Peter piles up 4 titles in a single sentence, and every one of them is lifted from what God said about Israel at Sinai. He takes the vocabulary of national election and applies it to a scattered, powerless, mostly Gentile minority who owned nothing and controlled nothing. That is an audacious thing to write, and it was meant to be. A chosen generation, chosen, eklektos, selected, picked out deliberately. Peter's readers were the opposite of chosen in every social sense that mattered in their world. They had been deselected, pushed out of guilds, excluded from civic life, dropped from family registries. Peter says there was another selection, and it happened first, and it is the one that determines who you actually are. A royal priesthood. 2 categories that were rigidly separate in Israel: kings from Judah, priests from Levi, and Peter fuses them. Kings exercise authority. Priests mediate access. Peter says both belong to you, not because you have risen, but because you are joined to the one who is both, an holy nation, set apart as a people. Peter's readers had no political existence, no territory, no army. He tells them they constitute a nation anyway, one that cuts across every existing border, whose citizens have more in common with a stranger in another province than with their own neighbors. A peculiar people. This one has been damaged by 4 centuries of English drift. Peculiar in 1611 did not mean odd. It meant belonging exclusively to someone, from the Latin peculium, private property. The Greek is a phrase meaning a people for God's own possession. You are His, not on loan, not conditionally His. Now notice where Peter places all of this. It comes before nearly all of the practical instruction in the letter. Chapters 2 through 5 will tell these believers how to conduct themselves under unjust masters, difficult marriages, hostile neighbors, and open persecution. All of that comes after this. Peter establishes identity, then gives instruction, and never the reverse. That order is not a stylistic preference. It is the difference between 2 entirely different religions. If instruction comes first, then your identity is the reward for compliance, and you spend your life auditioning for a status you never quite secure. If identity comes first, then the instruction is simply the description of how a person who already has that status lives. One produces exhaustion. The other produces gratitude, and gratitude is far more durable fuel. And then the purpose, that ye should show forth the praises of him who hath called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. The word show forth means to publish, to announce, to make known what was hidden. You were not given this identity to enjoy privately. You were given it so that the character of the one who called you would become visible in a dark place. Peter, of all people, understood being called out of darkness. He had stood in a courtyard at night by a charcoal fire and denied he knew the man. And then, on a beach beside another charcoal fire, he had been called back into the light by name, 3 times, 1 for each denial. Teaching 14. Strangers and pilgrims. Living as someone passing through. 1 Peter 2:11. Dearly beloved, I beseech you as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul. Peter uses 2 words that describe 2 different kinds of not belonging, and the difference between them is worth knowing. A stranger, paroikos, was a resident alien, someone who lived in a place permanently but never became a citizen. They paid taxes, ran businesses, raised children, and remained legally outside. A pilgrim, parepidemos, was a temporary visitor, someone passing through with a destination elsewhere. Peter puts both words together, and the combination is precise. You live here. You are genuinely present. You are not a tourist floating above the responsibilities of ordinary life, and you are not from here, and you are not staying. This is one of the most practically clarifying teachings in the entire letter, because it explains a persistent experience that many believers have and cannot account for. The sense of never quite fitting, of finding the values around you subtly foreign, even when you cannot articulate why, of being at home enough to function and never at home enough to settle. Peter says that feeling is not a defect. It is an accurate reading of your actual status. But watch what he attaches it to. He does not say, because you are strangers, disengage. He says, because you are strangers, abstain from fleshly lusts. He connects citizenship to self-control, and the logic is worth following. Fleshly lusts here is broader than sexual desire, though it certainly includes it. The phrase covers all the appetites that operate on the assumption that this world is all there is, the craving for status, comfort, revenge, accumulation, and sensation. What makes them fleshly is not that they involve the body, but that they are oriented entirely toward the temporary. And here is Peter's argument. Those appetites make sense for a citizen. If this is your only country, then maximizing pleasure and standing within it is entirely rational. But you are a pilgrim. You are carrying a passport from somewhere else, which makes an all-consuming pursuit of temporary things not merely wrong, but strange. Like a traveler with a flight in the morning signing a 30-year mortgage. Then Peter names the stakes, which war against the soul. The word is stratuomai, to conduct a military campaign, not a skirmish. A campaign with strategy, patience, and objectives. Peter is describing appetites that are not passive temptations, but active adversaries running a long operation against the innermost part of you. Anyone who has struggled with a habit they could not break recognizes the accuracy of this. These things do not attack once and retreat. They wait. They return when you are tired, when you are alone, when something has gone wrong, and you feel entitled to comfort. They know the terrain. Peter's counsel is not to be surprised by that, and not to fight it as a citizen fighting for territory he must hold, but as a pilgrim who has somewhere better to be and cannot afford to be delayed here. Teaching 15. Honorable conduct among outsiders. The long argument of a good life. 1 Peter 2:12. Having your conversation honest among the Gentiles, that whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. Peter's readers were being slandered. That is the situation behind this verse, and it was not vague. Early Christians were accused of cannibalism because of the language of eating the body and drinking the blood. They were accused of atheism because they refused to honor the state gods. They were accused of incest because they called each other brother and sister and married within the community. They were accused of hating humanity because they withdrew from public festivals. These were not misunderstandings that a well-worded statement could fix. And Peter's counsel to people being publicly lied about is remarkable for what it does not include. There is no instruction to defend themselves, no campaign of correction, no strategy for reputation management. There is one instruction: live well enough, long enough, in front of them. Having your conversation honest. Again, conversation means your entire manner of life, and the word translated honest is kalos, which means beautiful, admirable, attractive, as well as good. Peter is not asking merely for moral correctness. He's asking for a life that is visibly attractive, the kind of life that makes an accusation harder to sustain simply by existing near it, which they shall behold. The verb means to observe closely over time, to watch as a spectator watches something unfolding. Peter assumes his readers are being watched, and he is right. A suspected minority is always observed carefully. He tells them to let the observation continue. The truth about them will emerge not from argument, but from accumulated evidence. There is enormous relief in this teaching if you have ever been misunderstood in a way you could not correct. Most of us have. Someone has told a version of your story that is untrue, and the more energetically you contest it, the more you seem to confirm it. And eventually you learn that some accusations cannot be answered directly. Peter's word to that situation is that you do not have to win the argument. You have to keep living. A life is a long argument, and it is more persuasive than any single defense you could mount. Then the goal, that they may glorify God in the day of visitation. Peter's aim is not vindication. He does not say they will one day admit they were wrong about you. He says they may glorify God. The point of your honorable life is not to clear your name. It is to make God credible to people who currently find him not credible at all. The day of visitation most likely refers to the moment God comes near to a person, the hour when grace arrives and they see clearly. Peter's suggestion is that in that hour, what makes the difference is often the memory of a life, someone they watched, someone who was patient with them, decent when it cost something, unaccountably steady under pressure. That memory sits quietly for years and then becomes evidence when God draws near. Teaching 16, free and servants of God. What liberty is actually for. 1 Peter 2:16, as free and not using your liberty for a cloak of maliciousness, but as the servants of God. In 17 Greek words, Peter constructs one of the most balanced statements about freedom in the New Testament, and he holds together two things that most people, in most centuries, have found impossible to hold together. As free. Peter does not qualify this or soften it. He is writing to people who included actual slaves, and he tells them they are free. The freedom he means is not political, and he does not pretend otherwise. It is freedom from the law's condemnation, from the tyranny of sin, from the futile inherited way of life he mentioned in chapter 1, from the fear of death, and from the endless obligation of earning God's favor. That freedom is real, and it is not diminished by circumstances. A man in chains can possess it entirely, not using your liberty for a cloak of maliciousness. The word for cloak, epikaluma, means a covering, something laid over a thing to hide it. Peter is describing a specific and recognizable maneuver, using the language of freedom to conceal something that is simply wrong. Grace becomes the justification for the behavior. Liberty becomes the vocabulary of self-service. Peter had seen this early. Every movement built on grace attracts people who hear permission where grace intends release, and the church has never stopped producing them. The pattern is always the same. A person does what they wanted to do anyway, and then finds a theological word to lay over it, but as the servants of God. And here is the resolution. The word is doulos, bond servant, the strongest word in Greek for one who belongs entirely to a master. Peter puts free and doulos in the same sentence without embarrassment, because in his understanding they are not opposites. You were bought out of one ownership into another. Freedom is not the absence of a master. It is having the right one. This is a genuinely countercultural claim, and it was as strange in Peter's world as in ours. The modern definition of freedom is the maximization of available options and the absence of external constraint. Peter's definition is different. Freedom is being released from what was destroying you and bound to the one who is good. In his framework, unlimited options are not freedom at all. They are a person adrift, at the mercy of whichever appetite is loudest that day. Consider how this works in ordinary life. A musician who has bound themselves to an instrument for 20 years can play anything they imagine. A person who has never submitted to that constraint has every option available and can produce nothing. The constraint did not reduce their freedom. It created it. Peter is saying that the human soul works the same way. Submission to God is not the price of freedom. It is the form freedom takes. So the practical test of Christian liberty is simple, and Peter gives it plainly. Does this use of my freedom serve my master, or is it covering something? The question is uncomfortable precisely because it is answerable. Teaching 17, he left us an example, following in the steps of the one who suffered. 1 Peter 2:21, for even hereunto were ye called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example, that ye should follow his steps. The word Peter uses for example is hupogrammos, and it appears nowhere else in the New Testament. It comes from the ancient schoolroom. A teacher would write a line of letters at the top of a wax tablet, and the student would trace beneath it, copying the shape, learning the form by following the model exactly. That is the word. Christ wrote the line. You trace it. But notice precisely what Peter says the line consists of. He does not say Christ left us an example of miracles, or of teaching, or of leadership. He says Christ suffered, leaving us an example. The pattern being traced is a pattern of suffering rightly. And notice the phrase that opens the verse, "For even hereunto were ye called," called to this. Peter is telling suffering people that their suffering falls inside their calling rather than outside it, that it is not evidence of a mistake, a detour, or divine inattention. This must be handled honestly because it is easily abused. Peter is not saying that all suffering is good, or that suffering should be sought, or that people in genuinely harmful situations should stay in them because Jesus suffered. Read the context. He is speaking specifically about suffering that comes from doing right in a hostile environment. He is not blessing suffering in general. He's addressing the particular pain of being treated badly for being faithful, and telling those who bear it that they are walking in traceable footsteps. The image of following his steps is worth pausing on. The Greek suggests walking in tracks already made. Anyone who has walked through deep snow behind someone taller knows what this means physically. The one in front breaks the path. You step into what is already broken, and the walking is possible because someone went first at a cost. That is Peter's claim about suffering. There is no situation of faithful suffering you can enter where you arrive first. He was slandered before you were. He was misjudged by people who had decided in advance. He was abandoned by friends who had promised otherwise. And Peter, who was one of them, is the one telling you this. He knew failure from the inside, and he knew that the footprints in front of him had been made by someone who never once retaliated. There is a particular comfort in this that other comforts cannot provide. When people try to console someone who is suffering, the most common failure is offering understanding that has not been earned. Peter is not offering that. He is saying that Christ is not sympathizing from a distance. He is ahead of you on the same road, and the road goes somewhere because he came out the other side of it. That is the crucial part. The steps do not end at the cross. They continue through the tomb and out, which means tracing them is not resignation to an endless hard path. It is following someone who has already demonstrated where the path lets out. Teaching 18, he committed himself to him who judges righteously, where to put the injustice. 1 Peter 2:23, who, when he was reviled, reviled not again. When he suffered, he threatened not, but committed himself to him that judgeth righteously. This is Peter describing something he watched. He was there for part of it, close enough to hear, and then he was in the courtyard, and then he was gone. Whatever he did not see personally, he heard about for the rest of his life from people who did. This verse is eyewitness testimony about the interior mechanism of Jesus under abuse. When he was reviled, reviled not again. The word means to be verbally abused, insulted, mocked. And the striking thing is not merely that Jesus did not retaliate. It is that he had, more than anyone who has ever lived, the material to retaliate with. He knew every accuser's history. He could have named the private sin of every man in that room. He said nothing. When he suffered, he threatened not. Threat is the last weapon of the powerless. When you cannot stop what is happening, you can still promise consequences later. It costs nothing, and it restores a fragment of dignity. Jesus, who actually could have delivered on any threat he made none. Now, Peter does not leave this as an inexplicable feat of restraint. He tells us the mechanism, and the mechanism is the practical heart of this teaching. But committed himself to him that judgeth righteously. The verb translated committed is paradidomi, to hand over, to deliver something into someone else's keeping. It is a banking word, a word for depositing something with a trustee. Jesus took the entire situation, the injustice, the verdict, the record of what was done and by whom, and handed it over to his Father. Understand why this matters. Retaliation is almost always an attempt to secure justice yourself, driven by the fear that if you do not, no one will. The insult will stand. The lie will be believed. The person will get away with it. That fear is what makes revenge feel not merely satisfying, but necessary. And the only thing that dissolves that necessity is genuine confidence that the matter is already in the hands of someone who will not mishandle it. Peter is not telling you to suppress your sense of injustice. He is telling you to relocate it. There is a difference between pretending you were not wronged and handing the wrong to a righteous judge. The first is denial, and it rots. The second is trust, and it releases. He also specifies who the judge is. Him that judgeth righteously, not leniently, not indifferently, righteously. Peter is not asking you to accept that what happened does not matter. He's telling you it matters so much that it has been placed before a court that cannot be deceived, cannot be bribed, will not lose the file, and will not be too tired at the end of the day to hear it properly. Practically, this teaching has a shape you can actually use. When the injustice returns to your mind at 2 in the morning, the instruction is not to argue yourself out of the feeling. It is to make a transaction. Name what was done. Name who did it. Hand it over, out loud if necessary, and then when it comes back the next night, hand it over again. Jesus did this under conditions none of us will face. It is available to you in an ordinary week. Teaching. 19. By his wounds you were healed. The cross as substitution. 1 Peter 2:24. Who his own self bare our sins in his own body on the tree, that we, being dead to sins, should live unto righteousness, by whose stripes ye were healed. Peter reaches for Isaiah 53, the 53rd chapter that describes a suffering servant 7 centuries before the events it describes, and applies it to what he watched with his own eyes. His own self bare our sins in his own body. Peter stacks the pronouns deliberately. His own self, his own body. He is closing every avenue by which this could be made abstract, not a principle, not a symbol. A body with a specific weight and specific wounds on a specific piece of wood. On an afternoon Peter could have described the weather of. The verb bear means to carry up, to lift and bear away. It is the word used in the Greek Old Testament for a priest bringing a sacrifice up to the altar. Jesus is both the one carrying and the thing carried, on the tree. Peter chooses this word, sulon, wood, timber, rather than the ordinary word for cross, and he does it because of Deuteronomy. Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. Peter is pointing at the curse. He is saying that Jesus did not merely die. He went to the place where the curse falls and stood in it. Then the purpose, that we, being dead to sins, should live unto righteousness. Peter never separates what Christ did for you from what it produces in you. The substitution is not the end of the sentence. There is a therefore built into it. Something died so that something could live. And if nothing is living, the question is worth asking honestly. And then the line everyone knows, by whose stripes ye were healed. The word for stripes is mollups, and it means a bruise or welt, the mark left on flesh by a blow. Peter uses the singular, by his bruise. This phrase has been made to carry a great deal of freight in some circles, so let us be careful and clear. In its context, Peter is speaking primarily of the healing of the soul. He says so explicitly 1 verse later, calling his readers sheep who have returned to the shepherd of their souls. The wound Peter has in view is the wound of sin, the fracture between a person and God, the thing that no other remedy touches. That does not mean God does not heal bodies. He does, and Peter had seen it and had done it. But if this verse is turned into a guarantee of physical healing on demand, it becomes an instrument of cruelty, because it forces sick believers to conclude that their continuing illness is a verdict on their faith. Peter, who wrote to people being tortured, was not writing that. What he was writing is more durable. He is telling people whose bodies were being marked that a healing has already occurred at the deepest level of their existence, and that it is not contingent, not partial, and not reversible. The stripes were not on your back. Someone else took the blow, and what it purchased was the mending of the one thing you could never mend yourself. Teaching 20. The shepherd and overseer of your souls, returning from the wandering. First, Peter 2:25. For ye were as sheep going astray, but are now returned unto the shepherd and bishop of your souls. Peter finishes a passage about the cross with a picture of sheep, and there is nothing sentimental in his choice. Sheep in the ancient world were not decorative. They were vulnerable, prone to wander without noticing, and entirely dependent on a shepherd for survival. Peter is not flattering his readers. He is describing them accurately, and himself along with them. Ye were as sheep going astray. The tense matters. This is what you were. The participle describes wandering as an ongoing condition rather than a single wrong turn. Sheep do not decide to leave. They graze, they follow the grass. They lift their heads, and the flock is gone, and they have no idea how far they have come or in which direction home lies. That is a truer picture of how most people drift from God than any story of dramatic rebellion. Very few believers make a decision to walk away. They follow the grass. One quiet compromise, one skipped practice, one season of being too busy, and then one day they look up, but are now returned. And the verb here is worth attention. In Greek, it can be read as passive. You were turned back, you were brought home, which is exactly right for sheep who cannot navigate. A lost sheep does not find its way back. It is found and lifted and carried. Unto the shepherd and bishop of your souls. Two titles: shepherd, poimen, the one who feeds, guides, protects, and knows the flock individually. Bishop, episkopos, meaning overseer, the one who watches over, who supervises with care and attention. Together they describe intimacy and vigilance, tenderness and authority, and of your souls, not merely of your circumstances. Peter is specific about the jurisdiction. There are many things in your life that God has not promised to arrange to your liking. Your soul is not one of them. The deepest part of you has an overseer who is actively watching it. There is a personal history in this verse that Peter does not mention and could not have forgotten. He is the sheep who wandered furthest and most publicly. He is the one who was turned back on a beach in Galilee when the risen Christ made breakfast and asked him 3 times whether he loved him, and gave him 3 times a job: feed my sheep. The man writing about the shepherd was personally restored by him and then commissioned to do the same work, which means this verse is also a promise about the range of the shepherd's reach. Peter knows exactly how far a person can go and still be brought back, because he went that far. He denied with oaths that he had ever known the man, and decades later he is writing pastoral letters to the church. If you are reading this, and some part of you believes you have wandered past the point of return, Peter is the wrong apostle to hold that belief in front of. He would tell you that sheep do not find their way home. They are carried. And that the shepherd's competence, not your navigation, is what settles the matter. Teaching 21. The hidden person of the heart, where real beauty is located. 1 Peter 3:3-4. Whose adorning let it not be that outward adorning of plaiting the hair and of wearing of gold, or of putting on of apparel, but let it be the hidden man of the heart, in that which is not corruptible, even the ornament of a meek and quiet spirit, which is in the sight of God of great price. Peter is addressing wives here in a section about marriage, but the principle he states reaches everyone, and he states it in a way that would have been startling in his culture. First, what he is not saying. He is not prohibiting braided hair, jewelry, or clothing, though this passage has been used that way. Read the sentence carefully, and the structure is comparative. Let your adorning not be that, but this. He is speaking about where a person locates their identity and invests their effort, not issuing a dress code. The proof is simple. The same construction, read literally, would prohibit the putting on of apparel altogether. What he is saying is that there are two places to build, and only one of them lasts. Outward adorning was, in the Roman world, an extraordinarily competitive arena. Elaborate hairstyles could take hours and required skilled slaves. Gold was worn as portable status. Clothing communicated rank precisely. For a woman in that culture, the outward was very often the only currency available, because so few other forms of power were. And Peter, writing to women with limited options, tells them there is a different economy. The hidden man of the heart, literally the hidden person of the heart, the inner self that nobody sees directly, in that which is not corruptible. There is that word again, the word Peter used of the inheritance. He is deliberately putting the inner life in the same category as heaven itself, immune to decay. That contrast is the whole argument. Every outward form of beauty is on a schedule. It requires maintenance, it is competitive, and time is undefeated against it. Anyone who has built their sense of worth on it will eventually be spending increasing effort to defend a diminishing position. Peter says there is something else you can build that appreciates rather than depreciates, a meek and quiet spirit. Both words are widely misunderstood. Meek, praus, is not weakness or passivity. It is the word used for a powerful animal brought under control, strength that has been disciplined. Quiet, hesuchios, does not mean silent or shy. It describes tranquility, the absence of internal agitation. Peter is describing someone who is not frantic, not driven by the need to prove, correct, or secure. A person with a settled interior, which is in the sight of God, of great price. The last phrase relocates the audience. Outward adornment has an audience of people who are, for the most part, not paying close attention and will forget. The inner self has an audience of one who misses nothing and assigns it enormous value. There is an obvious application beyond marriage and beyond women. Everyone is adorning something. Everyone is investing in a presentation. Peter's question is whether the thing you are working hardest on is the thing that will still exist in 50 years. Teaching. 22. Dwell with understanding when your prayers are hindered. 1 Peter 3:7. Likewise, ye husbands, dwell with them according to knowledge, giving honor unto the wife, as unto the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered. This is one of the most demanding verses in the letter, and its force depends entirely on knowing what a husband in the Roman world was legally entitled to. Under Roman law, the head of a household held extraordinary authority over his wife, children, and slaves. Wives had few practical protections. A husband was not required by anyone to be considerate, and his standing in society was completely unaffected by how he treated his family behind his own door. Into that world, Peter writes, "Dwell with them according to knowledge." The Greek is literally to live together according to knowledge, meaning study your wife, understand her, know what she carries and what she needs, and let your life with her be governed by that knowledge rather than by your right to do as you please. Peter is asking men in a culture that required nothing of them to become students of their wives, giving honor unto the wife. The word for honor is time, value, worth, price. It is the word used for the assessment of something precious. Peter tells men to publicly and practically assign high value to the person the law regarded as their property, as unto the weaker vessel. This phrase has caused a great deal of trouble, and mostly needlessly. The word vessel refers to both husband and wife. The comparative implies two vessels, and Peter is speaking of relative physical strength, which in a world without machines was the dominant form of practical power. He is not making a claim about intellectual or spiritual capacity, and he demolishes any such reading in the very next clause, as being heirs together of the grace of life, together, equal heirs. In a legal system where inheritance ran through males and a wife's standing was derivative, Peter says that in the thing that ultimately matters, they receive identically. Whatever authority structure exists in this life, before God there is one inheritance and they are co-heirs of it. And then the sentence that gives this teaching its teeth, that your prayers be not hindered. The word means to cut in, to obstruct, to block a road. Peter is telling husbands that the way they treat their wives affects their access to God. Not their salvation, that is not what he says, but the working of their prayer life. A man can maintain every religious practice, attend everything, know his doctrine, and find that something is obstructed, and the obstruction is located in his own house. This is one of the clearest statements in Scripture, that private conduct and spiritual life are not separate compartments. God is not indifferent to what happens at home. There is no arrangement in which a person is harsh with the people closest to them and unimpeded in the presence of God. Teaching 23. Repay evil with blessing, breaking the chain, instead of extending it. 1 Peter 3:9. Not rendering evil for evil, or railing for railing, but contrariwise blessing, knowing that ye are thereunto called, that ye should inherit a blessing. Peter is describing a chain, and he is telling his readers where to break it. Evil for evil is the oldest arrangement in human society. It feels like justice, and in a limited sense it is. The ancient law that limited retaliation to an eye for an eye was actually a restraint, designed to prevent a stolen goat from becoming a generational feud. But limitation is not the same as resolution. A chain that is regulated is still a chain. Railing for railing is the verbal version, and it is the one most of us practice daily. Someone speaks with contempt, and something in us reaches immediately for a response with equal or slightly greater force. It happens in traffic, in comment sections, in kitchens, and in churches. It is so instinctive that we usually do not experience it as a choice. Peter says, contrariwise, blessing, not neutrality, not the impressive self-control of saying nothing. Blessing, actively speaking good over the person who spoke evil over you, actively desiring and asking for their good. This is a much harder instruction than silence, and it is important to see why Peter goes this far. Silence stops the chain from extending, but it leaves the person holding the injury. Blessing does something else. It converts. It takes the energy of the offense and spends it in the opposite direction. Peter is not asking for restraint. He is asking for reversal. He knows this is not natural, which is why he supplies a reason, knowing that ye are thereunto called. You were called to this. It is not an advanced option for unusually gracious personalities. It is the ordinary vocation of a believer. And then the second reason, which contains the actual power source, that ye should inherit a blessing. Here is the logic of the whole verse. You can afford to give blessing away because you are an heir to one. A person who is running low on something guards it. A person who has an inheritance coming can be generous with what they have now. This connects back to everything Peter established in chapter 1. The inheritance is incorruptible, undefiled, unfading, reserved, which means that when someone treats you badly, they cannot touch your actual holdings. They can damage your day, your reputation, occasionally your circumstances. They cannot reach the reserve. And a person who genuinely believes that is free to respond in a way that would be reckless for someone whose entire estate was exposed. There is also a hard-eyed realism in this teaching that is often missed. Peter does not say the other person will change. He does not promise that blessing your enemy will soften them. Sometimes it does. Often it does not. The promise attached is not about their transformation, but about your inheritance. You bless because of who you are and what is yours, not because of what it will produce in them, which is, in the end, the only version of this instruction anyone can actually sustain. Blessing offered as a technique to change someone will collapse the moment it fails. Blessing offered because you are an heir will not. Teaching 24. Always ready to give an answer. Hope that invites the question first. Peter 3:15. But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asketh you a reason of the hope that is in you with meekness and fear. This is probably the most quoted verse in Peter's letters, and it is regularly quoted at half its length, which changes it considerably. Start with what comes first, because Peter puts it first for a reason. Sanctify the Lord God in your hearts. Set Christ apart as holy in your interior life. Before any conversation with anyone else, there is a private act of enthronement. Peter is saying that public readiness is downstream of private settledness. A person who has not settled the question inside will not be steady when it is raised outside. Be ready always. The word is hetoimos, prepared, standing by. Peter assumes the question will come and that it will come unscheduled, not in a debate hall, in a break room, in a hospital corridor, in a car, at a funeral, to give an answer. The Greek is apologia, a formal defense, the word for what a defendant presents in court. It does not mean an apology in the modern sense, and it does not mean an argument in the sense of a quarrel. It means a reasoned account of your position. To every man that asketh you. Here is the part most often skipped. The verse describes a response to a question. Peter does not say, be ready always to raise the subject. He says, be ready when someone asks. This is a posture of preparedness, not of ambush, which raises the question this teaching is really about. Why would anyone ask? A reason of the hope that is in you. There it is. The question comes because the hope is visible. Peter is writing to people whose circumstances did not warrant hope, and whose neighbors could see that clearly. When someone in a genuinely bad situation is not falling apart, it produces curiosity, a specific, unavoidable curiosity that eventually becomes a question. What is holding you together? That reframes the entire verse. The apologetic task is not first intellectual. It begins with a life that raises a question requiring an explanation. If nobody ever asks, the issue may not be that we lack answers. It may be that we are living in a way that generates no questions. Then the manner, with meekness and fear. Meekness, that disciplined strength again. Fear, reverence, a serious awareness of God. Peter prescribes the tone as carefully as the content, and the two are inseparable in his mind. It is entirely possible to give a completely accurate answer in a way that guarantees it will not be received. Peter forbids that. Being right is not permission to be superior. Practically, this means two disciplines most believers underinvest in. The first is knowing what you actually believe and why, well enough to say it plainly to someone who does not share your vocabulary. The second is developing a tone that makes the truth hearable, the kind of gentleness that signals to a person that you are not trying to win. Teaching 25. Better to suffer for doing good. The two kinds of pain. First, Peter 3:17. For it is better if the will of God be so, that ye suffer for well-doing, than for evil-doing. Peter draws a distinction here that sounds obvious and is in practice one of the most stabilizing things a suffering person can learn. Not all suffering is the same, and knowing which kind you are in changes what you should do about it. There is suffering that is the consequence of your own wrongdoing. Peter is blunt about this in the next chapter, where he says plainly that no one should suffer as a murderer, a thief, or a meddler in other people's affairs. That kind of suffering is not persecution. It is harvest, and the response to it is not endurance, but repentance. Then there is suffering that comes precisely because you did what was right. You told the truth, and it cost you the position. You refused the arrangement everyone else had accepted and were frozen out. You stayed faithful in a situation where leaving would have been easier and nobody would have blamed you. Peter says the second kind is better. That word deserves a moment, because on the surface it makes little sense. The pain may be identical, sometimes it is worse. What makes it better is what it does and does not do to you. Suffering for wrongdoing carries shame that eats at the foundation. It confirms the accusation. It makes you smaller. Suffering for doing right carries something else entirely. It may hurt more, but it does not corrode. You can look at it directly. It builds rather than dismantles. And there is the clause in the middle that Peter does not let us skip. If the will of God be so. He does not say faithful people will always suffer, nor that suffering is always God's will for a given person. He locates it under God's will as a possibility to be reckoned with, not a badge to be sought. This matters because there is a version of Christian suffering that is manufactured. Some people create their own opposition through abrasiveness, poor judgment, or a need to feel embattled, and then interpret the resulting friction as faithfulness. Peter's qualification quietly rules that out. The question is not whether people are unhappy with you. It is whether the thing they are unhappy about is actually righteous. The practical value of this teaching is diagnostic, and it is worth applying honestly when you are in pain. Ask, is this the consequence of something I did wrong, something I did right, or simply something that happened in a broken world? All three exist. All three feel similar from the inside, but the responses differ entirely. The first calls for repentance and repair. The second calls for endurance and the committing of your case to the righteous judge. The third calls for lament and patience. Confusing them produces an enormous amount of unnecessary suffering. People repent for things that were never sins. People endure situations they should have corrected. Peter's small comparative sentence is a tool for telling them apart. Teaching. 26. Arm yourself with the same mind, deciding before the moment comes. 1 Peter 4:1. Forasmuch then as Christ hath suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves likewise with the same mind, for he that hath suffered in the flesh hath ceased from sin. The word Peter chooses here is military, and he chooses it deliberately. Arm yourselves, hoplizo from hoplon, a soldier's weapon or piece of armor. It is the word for a soldier equipping himself before an engagement. And the equipment Peter tells them to put on is not a virtue or a practice. It is a mind, a settled way of thinking adopted in advance. This is the second time in the letter Peter has issued a command about the mind, and the pattern is now unmistakable. He believes most spiritual failure happens in the moment because the thinking was never done beforehand. A soldier does not decide whether to carry a shield once the arrows are in the air. The same mind means the mind Christ had, specifically the settled willingness to suffer rather than to sin. That was the decision underneath Gethsemane. Not my will, but thine. Not a sudden burst of courage in a crisis, but a resolution reached in advance and then held when the moment arrived. Consider how much of ordinary life this reframes. Nearly every significant moral failure is decided before it occurs. The person who compromises under pressure did not usually choose to compromise at that moment. They arrived at the moment having decided nothing, and the pressure did the deciding for them. Whereas the person who has settled the question beforehand, I will not lie about this, whatever it costs, I will not go there, whatever the invitation, meets the same pressure-wearing armor. Then the phrase that puzzles many readers, for he that hath suffered in the flesh hath ceased from sin. Peter is not teaching that suffering makes a person sinless. He is describing a decisive break. The person who has genuinely accepted that following Christ may cost them physically has removed sin's primary leverage, because that is what sin uses. Its power in most lives is not the appeal of the sin itself, but the avoidance of a cost. You lie to avoid consequences. You stay silent to avoid exclusion. You compromise to avoid loss. Remove the fear of the cost and the mechanism jams. A person who has already made peace with suffering cannot be steered by the threat of it. This is precisely what changed in Peter himself, and he knows it better than anyone. The man in the courtyard had not armed himself. He had made a loud declaration at dinner and then arrived at the fire with nothing prepared, and a servant girl's question was enough to bring him down. The man writing this letter had by then stood before the same council that condemned Jesus and told them to their faces that he would obey God rather than men. The same person, different armor. So the instruction is to do your deciding early. Not in the abstract, but concretely, about the specific pressures you already know are coming this week. Decide now, while nothing is at stake, what you will do when something is. Teaching 27, the end of all things is at hand. Sober prayer in the meantime. 1 Peter 4:7. But the end of all things is at hand. Be ye therefore sober, and watch unto prayer. Peter states the largest possible fact and then draws from it the most modest possible conclusion, and the gap between the two is the entire lesson. The end of all things is at hand. In Greek, has drawn near. Peter means it. History has an end. That end is not far off, and everything happening now is happening in its shadow. Given that, what should a person do? Peter's answer would disappoint anyone hoping for drama. Be clear-headed. Pray. That is not what people usually do with the end of the world. Throughout church history, the arrival of end-times conviction has produced abandoned jobs, sold farms, date-setting, hilltop vigils, and a great deal of subsequent embarrassment. It has also produced the opposite, a nervous, adrenalized way of living in which everything is a sign and nothing is peaceful. Peter's response to the imminence of the end is neither. It is sobriety. Be ye therefore sober. That word again, nepho, clear-headed, unintoxicated. Peter uses it a third time here, and the repetition tells you what he considers most at risk in a pressurized environment. Not doctrine, judgment. The capacity to think straight when everything around you is loud. The second word is even more pointed, watch. The Greek means to be alert and self-controlled, and it is difficult not to hear something personal in Peter's choice of it. He is the man who could not stay awake in Gethsemane, who was told directly to watch and pray, and slept instead. That failure was among the last things Jesus said to him before the arrest. Decades later, he is writing the same instruction to the whole church. Watch unto prayer, literally be alert for the sake of prayer, so that you are able to pray. Peter makes sobriety the servant of prayer. An intoxicated mind cannot pray. Neither can a frantic one or an exhausted one, or one that has spent the entire day being agitated by things it cannot affect. His concern is that the state of your inner life is upstream of your ability to speak with God at all. That is a strikingly practical observation. Many people experience prayerlessness as a spiritual failure and try to solve it with more resolve. Peter suggests the problem may sit further back. If the mind is saturated, scattered, and stimulated from morning to night, prayer will feel impossible. Not because faith is weak, but because the instrument is not calm enough to be used. And notice the connection to the end. Because everything is heading somewhere, the most valuable thing you can do is stay clear enough to remain in contact with the one it is heading toward. The end is coming, therefore do not panic, do not check out, do not get swept along. Keep your head, stay awake, pray. Teaching 28. Love covers a multitude of sins, the grace that does not publish. 1 Peter 4:8. And above all things have fervent charity among yourselves, for charity shall cover the multitude of sins. Above all things. Peter has been issuing a rapid series of instructions, and here he stops to rank them. Of everything he has said about community life, this one goes on top. Fervent charity. There is that athletic word again, ektenes, the stretched muscle, love at full extension. Peter used it in chapter 1 and returns to it here, which means the strenuous quality of love was not a passing remark. It is his settled view. Love in the church is work. For charity shall cover the multitude of sins. This phrase has been misread in two opposite directions, and both misreadings do damage. The first misreading takes it to mean that loving people earns forgiveness for your own sins. It does not. Peter is drawing on Proverbs. Hatred stirs up strife, but love covers all sins, where the covering is something you do for others, not something you accumulate for yourself. The second misreading takes covering to mean concealment, that love means hiding serious wrongdoing, protecting reputations, and keeping damaging things quiet. That reading has been used to shelter abusers, and it must be named and rejected plainly. Peter is not instructing anyone to conceal sins that harm people. Elsewhere, he insists on accountability, and the wider New Testament requires that serious sin be confronted. Covering is not covering up. What Peter means is something else, and something most of us need daily. In any community of people living closely, there is a constant stream of small offenses, the careless word, the forgotten commitment, the tone that landed wrong, the slight that was probably not intended. A multitude of them. And every single one presents a choice. You can pick it up and carry it, or you can let love cover it. To cover, in this sense, means to refuse to make something into a case. Not to pretend it did not happen, but to absorb it and let it end there. No mentioning it later, no storing it as evidence, no informing 3 other people in the form of a prayer request. This is the difference between communities that last and communities that fracture, and it is almost never the large sins that decide it. Churches rarely split over doctrine. They split over accumulated small offenses that nobody covered, which were kept, compared, and eventually organized into sides. A person who covers is doing genuine spiritual work, and it is invisible work. That is what makes it costly. You absorb something and nobody knows you absorbed it. There is no credit. That is precisely why Peter calls it fervent love rather than politeness. Politeness avoids conflict for the sake of comfort. Covering love takes the hit knowingly on purpose for the sake of the other person and the health of the whole body. Teaching 29. Hospitality without grumbling, opening the door and meaning it. First, Peter 4:9. Use hospitality one to another without grudging. In the first century, this was not a suggestion about entertaining. It was infrastructure. There were no hotels in the modern sense, and the inns that existed were dangerous, filthy, and frequently attached to brothels. Travelers depended on households. Traveling teachers, messengers, carrying letters between churches, believers displaced by persecution, and families who had lost their homes moved across the empire on a network of open doors. Without hospitality, the early church would have had no communication system, no missionary movement, and no refuge for the displaced. When Peter commands hospitality, he is commanding the thing that held the whole movement together. The Greek word is philoxenos, literally love of the stranger, which is worth pausing on because it is the opposite of the instinct most of us have. Xenophobia, fear of the stranger, is built from the same root. Peter is not asking people to entertain their friends. He is asking them to love the person they do not know, who arrives with needs, who will occupy space in their home and eat their food, and who may be difficult. And then the phrase that makes this teaching honest, without grudging. The Greek word means without murmuring, without complaint. It is the same word used for the muttering of Israel in the wilderness, the low, continuous grumbling that goes on underneath obedience. Peter is naming something we all recognize. It is entirely possible to do a generous thing resentfully, to open your home while keeping an internal ledger of the cost, to serve while complaining afterward to your spouse about how much it took out of you. The act is correct, and the interior is sour, and the guest can usually feel it no matter how well it is hidden. Peter is not satisfied with the act. He wants the act and the interior to match. That is a demanding standard, and it is worth asking how anyone reaches it. The answer is buried in the surrounding context. Peter has just called his readers heirs of an incorruptible inheritance, and he is about to call them stewards of God's grace. Grumbling in hospitality is almost always a scarcity problem. I am spending something limited on someone who cannot repay me. Peter's whole letter attacks the premise. You are not running down a finite reserve. You are distributing something from a supply that is not yours and does not diminish. There is also an obvious modern application because hospitality in the wealthy world has quietly become something else. It has become entertaining, which requires a house that is presentable, food that is impressive, and a level of preparation that most people cannot sustain. Under that definition, hospitality becomes an occasional performance, and the ordinary open door disappears. Peter's version is much simpler and much more available. It is not a dinner party. It is a place at the table, an unmade guest room, a plate of whatever you were already eating, given to someone who needs it, with a face that means it. Teaching 30. Stewards of the manifold grace of God. Your gift is not yours, lest. Peter 4:10-11. As every man hath received the gift, even so minister the same one to another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. If any man speak, let him speak as the oracles of God. If any man minister, let him do it as of the ability which God giveth. 2 words carry this teaching, and both of them adjust the way you hold whatever you are good at. The first is steward. The Greek oikonomos was a household manager, often a trusted slave, who administered his master's property. He handled significant wealth. He made real decisions. He directed other servants, and he owned none of it. Everything that passed through his hands belonged to someone else, and he would give an account of how he had used it. Peter says that is what you are with respect to your gifts, not an owner, a manager, which resolves in a single word the 2 errors people make about their abilities. The first error is pride. This is mine. I developed it. I deserve what it earns me. The steward image removes that at the root. You did not create the capacity, the circumstances that developed it, the health that sustains it, or the opportunity to use it. The second error is the opposite, and in church settings, it is more common. False humility, the quiet insistence that you have nothing worth contributing. The steward image removes that too. A steward who buries the property is not humble. He is failing at his job. Peter says every man hath received. The assumption is universal. Nobody in the room is giftless. The second keyword is manifold. The Greek poikilos means many-colored, variegated, like a woven fabric with different threads. Peter is saying God's grace does not arrive in one form. It comes in many colors, and each believer has been given a different shade of it, which means the church is not meant to look like a room of people doing the same thing well. It is meant to look like a tapestry, and a tapestry requires threads that do not match. The person who serves quietly, and the person who teaches publicly are not on different tiers. They are different colors of the same grace. Peter then divides the gifts into two broad categories, which is a useful simplification. If any man speak, the word gifts, teaching, encouraging, counseling, let him speak as the oracles of God, meaning with the seriousness of someone handling God's own words, rather than offering personal opinion with a verse attached. If any man minister, the serving gifts, practical work, administration, help. Let him do it as of the ability which God giveth. Peter's instruction to servers is about the power source. Serving is where burnout lives, because serving is largely invisible and endlessly demanded. Peter says, serve out of supplied strength, not out of your own reserves. The moment you are serving on your own energy alone, you have moved from stewardship to self-destruction, and the resentment that follows is predictable. Teaching. 31. Do not be surprised at the fiery trial, recalibrating your expectations. 1 Peter 4:12-13. Beloved, think it not strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened unto you, but rejoice, inasmuch as ye are partakers of Christ's sufferings. Peter addresses something here that adds enormous weight to suffering and is almost never named: surprise. Think it not strange. The Greek verb means to be startled by something foreign, to treat an event as alien and out of place. Peter is telling his readers not to add astonishment to their pain. This is more significant than it first appears. When something hard happens, the pain itself is one burden. But there is a second burden layered on top of it, and it is often heavier, the sense that this should not be happening, that a mistake has been made, that the arrangement has been violated, that God has failed to hold up an agreement. That second burden is generated by expectation, and expectation is something teaching can change. Peter is doing exactly that. He is reaching into his readers' assumptions and adjusting them so that when the fire comes, it does not also carry the shock of betrayal. Not because the pain will be less, but because the confusion will be. The fiery trial which is to try you. Literally, the burning among you which is happening for your testing. Note the present tense. Peter is not warning about a hypothetical future. It is already occurring. And note that he calls it a testing, not a punishment. The vocabulary is from chapter 1, the refiner's fire aimed at what is not gold. Then Peter goes further than most of us would dare. But rejoice, inasmuch as ye are partakers of Christ's sufferings. This must be handled carefully because it can be turned into something cruel. Peter is not telling suffering people to feel happy about their suffering. That is not what the word means, and the man who wept bitterly in a courtyard would not have demanded it of anyone. The rejoicing he describes is not an emotion about the pain. It is a recognition of what the pain means. Partakers of Christ's sufferings, koinonos, the word for one who shares, a partner, a participant. Peter's claim is that faithful suffering is not isolation from Christ. It is contact with him. The very thing that feels like abandonment is, in fact, the closest fellowship available in this life, because it is the one place where your experience and his overlap directly. There is nothing sentimental in this. Peter is writing to people who would lose their lives. He is telling them that in the fire they are not further from Christ than they were in the easy years. They are nearer. And that is a genuinely different way to hold pain. Not as evidence of divine absence, but as the location where a particular kind of nearness happens, one that a comfortable life cannot access. Teaching 32. Commit your soul to a faithful Creator. Where to put yourself first. Peter 4:19. Wherefore let them that suffer according to the will of God commit the keeping of their souls to him in well-doing, as unto a faithful Creator. This is the closing line of Peter's long section on suffering, and it functions as the practical summary. After all the theology, here is what you actually do. Commit the keeping of their souls to Him. The verb is paratithemi, and it is a banking term, to deposit something valuable with a trustee for safekeeping. It is the same word Jesus used from the cross. Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. Peter is telling suffering believers to make the deposit Jesus made. Consider what that image implies. A deposit is a transfer of custody. The thing remains yours, but it is no longer in your keeping. You are not carrying it anymore, and you are no longer responsible for defending it. That is precisely what Peter is asking. There is a way of enduring hardship in which you remain the guardian of your own soul, monitoring your condition, defending your position, managing the outcome. Peter says, hand it over. And notice what he calls God at the moment of the deposit. Not judge, not king, faithful creator. It is the only time in the New Testament God is called creator with this particular word. And the choice is precise. Creator says, He made this, He made you. He knows the design, the tolerances, the load your particular soul can bear. When you deposit yourself with the Creator, you're placing yourself with the only one who has complete knowledge of what you are and how you work. Faithful says, He does not change and He does not lose things. In a season when everything else has proven unreliable, health, employment, people who promised otherwise, Peter names the one attribute that a suffering person most needs to be true and attaches it to the one receiving the deposit. Then the phrase that keeps this from becoming passivity in well-doing: continue doing good. Peter's instruction is not to withdraw, wait, and protect yourself until the season passes. It is to hand over the custody of your soul and then keep working. Keep serving, keep showing up, keep being decent to people who have not earned it. That combination is the whole Christian posture under pressure, and each half is useless without the other. Committing without well-doing becomes fatalism, a spiritual-sounding surrender that quietly stops living. Well-doing without committing becomes exhaustion, a person carrying both the labor and the outcome which no one can sustain. Peter has watched people do this badly in both directions. His counsel is exact. Put your soul in the hands of the one who made it and has never once been unfaithful, and then get up tomorrow and do good. Teaching 33. Shepherd the flock willingly. How authority is supposed to work. 1 Peter 5:2-3. Feed the flock of God which is among you, taking the oversight thereof, not by constraint, but willingly, not for filthy lucre, but of a ready mind, neither as being lords over God's heritage, but being ensamples to the flock. Peter is speaking to elders now, and there is something quietly moving in how he introduces himself before he does it. He calls himself a fellow elder, not the chief apostle, not the rock, not the one Christ named. A fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ. He steps down to their level before he says a word about leadership, which is itself the entire lesson in miniature. Feed the flock of God which is among you. Two phrases in that clause do most of the work. Of God, the flock is not the shepherd's property. He is managing someone else's sheep, and the owner is coming back. And among you, the shepherd lives with the flock, not above it. He is inside the field, not observing from a house on the hill. Then Peter lists 3 corruptions of spiritual authority, and each one is paired with its healthy alternative. He is describing the ways leadership goes wrong, and 2,000 years later, the list has not needed updating. Not by constraint, but willingly. The first corruption is reluctant leadership, a person shepherding because they were pressured, or because nobody else would, or because a role was inherited and they never found a way out. Peter says the flock can tell. A resentful shepherd communicates something to the sheep no amount of competence conceals, not for filthy lucre, but of a ready mind. The second corruption is financial. Peter's phrase is strong, shameful gain, and its presence in a first-century letter tells you the problem is not modern. Note that he does not say elders should be unpaid. Scripture elsewhere affirms that they may be supported. He says the money must not be the motive. The test is not whether you receive anything but what you would do if the receiving stopped. Neither is being lords over God's heritage. The third corruption is domination. The Greek word is the root of despot. This is leadership by control, managing people, requiring compliance, treating a congregation as a base of personal authority. It is the failure Jesus specifically forbade, and Peter had heard him forbid it directly on a night when the disciples were arguing about who was greatest. But being in samples to the flock. The alternative to domination is example. Not lower standards, higher ones, applied first to yourself. A leader who cannot command can still go first. And going first is, in the end, the only form of spiritual authority that produces anything lasting, because people follow what they have seen far more reliably than what they have been told. This teaching is not only for people with titles. Anyone with influence over another person's spiritual life, a parent, a mentor, an older friend, a small group host, is functioning under these three tests. Am I doing this willingly? Am I doing it for what I get? Am I leading by example or by leverage? Teaching 34, clothed with humility, the garment you tie on. 1 Peter 5:5. Yea, all of you be subject one to another, and be clothed with humility, for God resisteth the proud, and giveth grace to the humble. The verb Peter uses for clothed is unusual and specific, egkombumai. It refers to tying on an apron, the garment a household slave fastened over their clothing before beginning work. It was a visible marker of a servant's status, and it is almost impossible that Peter chose this word by accident. He had been in a room where Jesus stood up from supper, laid aside his outer garment, tied a towel around himself, and washed the feet of 12 men, including the one who was about to betray him. Peter had objected. He had said, "You shall never wash my feet." And Jesus had answered that unless he did, Peter had no part with him. Decades later, Peter writes, "Tie on the apron." He is telling the whole church to do what he once refused to allow. That is a man who has understood what he was shown. Notice that humility here is not a feeling. You do not tie on a mood. Peter treats it as a garment you put on deliberately, an action taken regardless of how you feel that morning. This is enormously practical. Most people wait to feel humble and never do, because pride does not announce itself and rarely feels like pride from the inside. It feels like accuracy. It feels like knowing your own worth. Peter bypasses the feeling and gives an action. Put the apron on and go serve someone. Then he grounds the command in something larger. For God resisteth the proud and giveth grace to the humble. This is a quotation from Proverbs, and the language is severe. The word resisteth is a military term, to array oneself against, to line up in opposition. Peter is saying that God does not merely dislike pride. He takes up a position against it. Sit with the weight of that. There is a stance a person can adopt in which the God who is for them is, in that specific matter, standing across from them. Not because he has stopped loving them, but because pride is the one posture that makes a person unable to receive anything, and love that cannot give must first remove the obstruction. And the flip side is just as absolute. Giveth grace to the humble. Grace flows downhill. It always has. Water does not pool on a peak. The humble receive not because humility earns anything. That would contradict the meaning of grace entirely. But because humility is the only shape a hand can take that is capable of holding a gift. Which means the practical question is not whether God is generous. He is. The question is what position you are standing in. Peter's answer, learned in a room with a basin of dirty water, is that you tie the apron on and get low, and grace runs to the low places. Teaching 35. Humble yourself under his mighty hand. The discipline of waiting first. Peter 5-6. Humble yourselves therefore under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time. This verse contains one of the most difficult phrases in the New Testament for a suffering person, and it is not the part about humility. It is the last three words. Humble yourselves, reflexive. It is something you do to yourself. Peter has just said, God gives grace to the humble. Now he says, the humbling is your action. Not something you passively receive, but something you actively perform. And it is not primarily about self-assessment. It is about position, under the mighty hand of God. This image comes straight out of the Exodus, where the mighty hand of God is the phrase used again and again for his power in delivering Israel. But notice how Peter uses it. In Exodus, the mighty hand comes down on Egypt. Here, believers are told to place themselves under it. That is a striking place to stand. To put yourself under a hand is to make yourself subject to it, to accept that it may press down before it lifts. Peter is telling people in the middle of persecution to stop trying to get out from under God's dealings with them, and instead to submit to what is happening while it is happening. Not because the hand is careless, but because it is mighty, and because it is a hand rather than a machine, that he may exalt you. The promise is real, and Peter states it plainly. There is a lifting. The direction of the story is upward, in due time. And there it is. Two words that require more faith than nearly anything else in the letter. Because the difficulty in most seasons of hardship is not the belief that God can act. Most believers hold that easily. The difficulty is that he has not yet, and no timetable has been provided. In due time means at the right moment, in the proper season, and the season is his to determine, not yours to negotiate. This is where a great deal of quiet spiritual damage occurs. People can endure a great deal when they know how long. What is hard, sometimes unbearable, is enduring without a horizon. And Peter's counsel to that exact difficulty is not to supply a date, but to identify whose hand you are under. Because the length of the wait is bearable in proportion to your trust in the one setting it. If the hand is arbitrary, any delay is torment. If the hand belongs to a faithful Creator who deposited his own Son into the same waiting, 3 days in a tomb before the exaltation came, then delay is not indifference. It is timing. Peter himself waited. There was a period between the courtyard and the beach in which he did not know if there was anything left for him. It was not a long time in hours. It was a very long time in experience. And the restoration, when it came in the season the Lord chose, not the one Peter would have chosen. Teaching 36. Cast all your care upon him, the transfer of the weight. 1 Peter 5:7. Casting all your care upon him, for he careth for you. In the Greek, this is not a separate sentence. It is a participle attached to the previous verse. Humble yourselves, casting your care upon him, which means Peter regards the casting of anxiety as an act of humility. That connection is worth examining before anything else, because it is not obvious and it is not comfortable. Why would carrying your own worry be a form of pride? Because worry is, at bottom, an attempt to manage. It is the mind working continuously on a problem in the belief that sufficient vigilance will produce control. Underneath most chronic anxiety is an unexamined conviction that if I stop holding this, it will fall, that the outcome depends on my attention, that I am functionally the one keeping things together. Peter says that is the proud posture, and it is exhausting, and it is not true. Casting. The verb means to throw upon, to hurl. It is used in the Gospels for the disciples throwing their cloaks onto the colt Jesus rode into Jerusalem. It is a decisive movement, a transfer from one place to another, done at once. Not setting down gently, not sharing the load, throwing it off yourself and onto someone else. All your care. The word merimna means anxious concern, the distraction of a divided mind. It comes from a root meaning to divide or pull apart, which is exactly what anxiety does. It takes a person and splits them so that they are here and also somewhere in a future that has not happened. And Peter says all, not the large ones only, not the properly spiritual ones. The whole set, including the ones you would be embarrassed to name aloud because they are small and you should be past them. Then the reason, and everything depends on it, for he careth for you. The Greek is simple and warm. It matters to him concerning you. You are a matter of concern to God. Not tolerated, not processed as one item among billions. Peter says the God who holds the universe holds your particular situation as something that matters to him personally. This is the load-bearing claim, and it is why this verse can do what mere reassurance cannot. Most anxiety relief attempts to reduce the size of the problem. It is not that bad. It will probably work out. Other people have survived worse. Peter does not do that once. He never says the situation is small. He says the one receiving it is not. There is a practical honesty required here, though. Casting is rarely a single event. Most people throw the weight over and find it back on their shoulders within the hour, and then conclude that they have failed at this. That is not failure. That is the ordinary rhythm of it. The instruction is simply to do it again, and again the next morning. The casting is a practice, not a transaction, and the arms receiving it do not tire of the repetition. Teaching 37. Be sober, be vigilant, knowing that you have an adversary. First, Peter 5:8-9. Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about, seeking whom he may devour, whom resist steadfast in the faith, knowing that the same afflictions are accomplished in your brethren that are in the world. Immediately after telling his readers to throw their anxiety onto God, Peter tells them to stay alert because something is hunting them. Those two instructions sit side by side deliberately, and the arrangement is the point. Rest and vigilance are not opposites. You can be free of anxiety and still be awake. Be sober. For the fourth and final time in this letter, be vigilant, the same word he used about prayer, meaning to stay awake and watchful. Peter's last major instruction is a repetition of his first. Keep your head clear and stay awake. Your adversary, the devil. The word adversary is a legal term for the opposing party in a lawsuit, the one arguing against you in court. And devil, diabolos, means slanderer, accuser. Peter is describing a prosecutor, someone building a case, presenting evidence, seeking a verdict. That is worth knowing because it explains the texture of much spiritual oppression. It arrives as accusation, as a voice reciting your history with prosecutorial accuracy. Not usually as a temptation to do something dramatic, but as a sustained argument that you are disqualified, that the record is against you, that you of all people have no business claiming any of this. As a roaring lion walketh about, seeking whom he may devour. The imagery is fierce, and it should not be softened. Peter is not describing a nuisance. He is describing something that intends real destruction. But notice the limits Peter builds into the picture, because they are as important as the threat. The lion roars, and a hunting lion does not roar, because roaring warns the prey. Roaring is intimidation, not attack. Seeking whom he may devour. He is looking, which means he does not simply take. And walketh about. He moves, which means he is not everywhere at once. This is a creature with real menace and real limits, and Peter's readers needed both halves of that. Then the instruction, whom resist steadfast in the faith. Not flee, not negotiate. Resist, stand against, hold your ground, and steadfast in the faith, meaning the resistance is not a matter of willpower or intensity, but of standing on what is true. You resist an accuser by refusing his version of reality, which means the resisting is done with the content of the faith itself. I am redeemed at a price. I am an heir. The matter has been handed to a righteous judge. And then Peter adds something that is often overlooked and is enormously kind, knowing that the same afflictions are accomplished in your brethren that are in the world. You are not singled out. Isolation is one of the accuser's most effective tools. The conviction that your struggle is unique, that other believers do not deal with this, that something is uniquely wrong with you. Peter says plainly, the same thing is happening to your brothers and sisters across the world right now. Knowing that does not remove the fight. It removes the loneliness of it, and that is often the harder half. Teaching 38, the God of all grace will restore you. What happens after the suffering? First, Peter 5:10. But the God of all grace, who hath called us unto his eternal glory by Christ Jesus, after that ye have suffered a while, make you perfect, establish, strengthen, settle you. This is the summit of the letter. Everything Peter has been building arrives here, and it arrives as a promise rather than a command. The God of all grace. Peter has named God many ways in this letter: Father, Judge, Creator, Shepherd. He saves this one for last. All grace, meaning every variety of it, for every kind of need, in inexhaustible supply. After that ye have suffered a while. Peter refuses to pretend. He does not promise the suffering will be removed, and he does not say it will be brief in the way we want brief to mean. He says a while, a little, for a time, but the crucial word is after. The suffering is not the last chapter. It is a passage with an end and something on the other side of it. Then 4 verbs. Peter, writing to people whose lives were being dismantled, describes exactly what God will do with what is left, and each word is chosen with care. Make you perfect. The Greek katatizo means to mend, to repair, to restore something to its proper condition. It is the word used in the Gospels for the disciples mending their nets, sitting on the shore, working torn things back into usefulness. Peter had done that work with his own hands, hour after hour, for years. He knows that a mended net fishes, establish, to fix firmly, to make solid, to set on a foundation. The root is the same word Jesus used when he told Peter, "When you are converted, strengthen your brethren." God takes people who have been shaken and makes them unshakable. And he often does it through the very shaking. Strengthen, to fill with strength, to make vigorous. Not merely repaired and stable, but powerful. Not restored to what you were before, but made stronger than you were before. Settle. The Greek themeliou means to lay a foundation, to ground something on bedrock. It is the last word for a reason. This is the deep final work, not surface repair, but the establishment of a base that will hold whatever gets built on it for the rest of your life. Read the 4 together and notice the direction: mended, fixed, strengthened, grounded. That is a complete restoration, and every stage of it happens after the suffering rather than instead of it. Peter is not describing rescue from the furnace. He's describing what comes out of it, and he is describing himself. The man who wrote these 4 verbs was mended on a beach, established at Pentecost, strengthened in prisons and before councils, and grounded so thoroughly that tradition tells us he faced his own execution without recanting a word. He is not theorizing. He is testifying, teaching. 39 great and precious promises, partakers of the divine nature. Second, Peter 1:4. Whereby are given unto us exceeding great and precious promises, that by these ye might be partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world through lust. Peter's second letter has a different atmosphere than his first. He is older. He knows he is near the end. He says so explicitly that the time of his departure is at hand. He is writing what he most wants people to have after he is gone. And the first substantial thing he gives them is this: exceeding great and precious promises. Peter treats the promises of God as objects of enormous value, property, holdings, assets that have been given, not encouragement, not sentiment, given in the perfect tense, handed over and still in your possession. And then the astonishing purpose clause, that by these ye might be partakers of the divine nature. That phrase has to be handled with precision because it can be misread badly. Peter is not saying you become God or that the distinction between creator and creature blurs. That reading is foreign to everything else he wrote. What he is saying is that through Christ, believers come to genuinely share in God's own character and life, that the moral nature of God begins to take up residence in an ordinary human being. Which means Christianity is not primarily behavior modification. It is not God helping you become a better version of what you already are. It is the introduction of something new into a person, a nature that was not there before, that has different appetites and different capacities. This is why Peter can command holiness without cruelty. He is not telling people to imitate a nature they do not possess. He is telling them to live out one they have been given, having escaped the corruption that is in the world through lust. Peter names what you are escaping, and he is precise about the mechanism: corruption that operates through desire. Not corruption imposed from outside by force, but decay that enters by way of what a person wants. The world does not usually damage people against their will. It offers them what they crave and lets the craving do the work. And notice the order in the sentence. The promises come first. The partaking comes through the promises. The escape follows. That order is the practical key. Most attempts at change begin with the escape. I will stop this, I will break that pattern, and rely on willpower to hold a line against desire. Peter reverses it. He says you displace a desire by receiving something better, and the promises are the mechanism by which the better thing gets in. Which is why what you feed on matters so much. A person who spends years soaking in the promises of God is not merely accumulating information. They are, by Peter's account, becoming a different kind of creature, one for whom the old appetites gradually lose their grip, not because they were suppressed, but because they were outclassed. Teaching 40, add to your faith, the staircase of Christian growth, 2 Peter 1:5-8. And beside this, giving all diligence, add to your faith virtue, and to virtue knowledge, and to knowledge temperance, and to temperance patience, and to patience godliness, and to godliness brotherly kindness, and to brotherly kindness charity. For if these things be in you and abound, they make you that ye shall neither be barren nor unfruitful. Peter has just said, believers partake of the divine nature. Now he says, giving all diligence, effort, not effort that earns the nature, but effort that develops it. Both halves of that are necessary, and the church has historically struggled to hold them together. Emphasize only the gift, and you get a passive Christianity waiting to be changed. Emphasize only the effort, and you get an exhausting one trying to change itself. Peter puts them in a single sentence. The word ad, epikorigio, comes from the world of Greek theatre. A wealthy patron, the Chorgos, funded a chorus for a public festival, covering every cost lavishly. The word came to mean generous, abundant supply. Peter is not describing a grudging addition. He is describing a person outfitting their faith the way a patron outfitted a production, sparing nothing. Then the list, and the order is not arbitrary. Each quality is built on the one before it, like a staircase, to your faith, virtue, moral excellence, courage in action. Faith that never produces conduct has stalled on the first step. To virtue, knowledge, practical discernment, knowing how to apply the good you have committed to. Zeal without knowledge does damage, and Peter puts knowledge immediately after virtue for exactly that reason. To knowledge, temperance, self-control. Because knowledge without self-control produces someone who knows precisely what they should do and does not do it, which is one of the more painful conditions a person can live in. To temperance, patience. The Greek hupomone means endurance, staying under a weight. Self-control gets you through a moment. Endurance gets you through a decade. To patience, godliness, reverence toward God. Peter places this after endurance because endurance without God at the center hardens into mere grit, and grit is not the goal. To godliness, brotherly kindness, warmth toward fellow believers, reverence for God that does not produce affection for his people has gone wrong somewhere. And to brotherly kindness, charity, agape, love in its widest and most costly form, extending beyond the family to everyone, including the enemy. That is the top of the staircase, and Peter puts it there because it is the thing everything else was building toward. For if these things be in you and abound. Note the two conditions, present and increasing. Peter is not asking for perfection at any step. He is asking for growth at all of them. They make you that ye shall neither be barren nor unfruitful. The double negative is emphatic. Peter is addressing the quiet fear of many sincere believers, that their life is not producing anything, that the years are going by, and nothing is coming of them. His answer is that a life on this staircase will not be barren, not, may not, shall not. Teaching 41. The Lord is not slack. What the delay actually means. 2 Peter 3:9. The Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some men count slackness, but is long-suffering to us ward, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. Peter is answering a specific complaint. He mentions it a few verses earlier. People were asking where the promise of his coming was, pointing out that everything continues as it always has. It was a mocking question, but there were believers who felt its force privately. He said he was coming back. It has been a long time. Every generation since has felt this. And beneath the question about Christ's return sits a more personal version that most believers know intimately. I asked, and nothing has happened, and it has been years. Peter's answer does not adjust the timeline. It reinterprets the delay. The Lord is not slack concerning his promise. The word means slow in the sense of dilatory, negligent, late in fulfilling an obligation. Peter denies it flatly. What looks like lateness is not lateness. God has not lost track and he has not deprioritized. As some men count slackness, Peter names the real issue, counting, measurement. We are assessing God's timing with an instrument calibrated to a human lifespan, and the instrument is not adequate to what it is measuring. He has just said as much in the previous verse, reminding his readers that 1,000 years and a day are not distinguishable to God the way they are to us, but is long-suffering to us ward. Here is the reinterpretation, and it is remarkable. The delay is not neglect, it is patience, and specifically patience aimed at people, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. The delay exists because God is waiting for people. Every year that passes without the final reckoning is a year in which someone else turns around. Sit with the implication of that, because it is personally sharp. If you are a believer who came to faith at 30 or 50 or 70, then the delay you may have complained about is the very reason you are inside rather than outside. Someone before you was asking why God had not acted yet, and the answer, partly, was you. There is also a hard edge in this verse that should not be sanded down. Peter says, perish. He is not writing about a delay in a pleasant arrangement. He believes there is something to be saved from, and the urgency of his letter depends on it. The patience is real, and so is the thing the patience is holding back. And for the person waiting on a much smaller promise, a prayer unanswered for years, the principle still applies. The delay is not evidence of forgetfulness. In God's dealings, waiting is usually where something is being accomplished that could not be accomplished any faster, often in people other than yourself. Teaching 42. Grow in grace. The last word of a dying man. 2 Peter 3:18. But grow in grace and in the knowledge of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. To him be glory both now and forever. Amen. This is the final sentence Peter wrote. He knew his death was near. He had said earlier in this letter that he would soon put off this tent, and that the Lord had shown him it would be shortly. So these are the last words of a man who had been fishing on the Sea of Galilee when a stranger called him, who had walked on water and sunk, who had denied and been restored, who had preached at Pentecost and watched 3,000 people come in, who had been imprisoned and beaten and had buried most of the men he started with. And what he chose to leave out of everything he could have said was 2 words: grow and know. Grow in grace. Not merely be forgiven by grace, though that is where it starts. Grow in it. The word means to increase, to become larger, the ordinary word for the growth of a plant or a child. Peter's last instruction is not to arrive. It is to keep getting bigger in the thing that saved you. That is worth pausing on, because there is a version of the Christian life that treats grace as an entry requirement. The door you come through, after which you move on to more advanced matters. Peter, at the end of a life like his, says the growing happens in grace. You do not graduate from it, you go further in, and in the knowledge of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. The word is epignosis, knowledge that is full, personal, experiential, not information about someone, but acquaintance with them. Peter is not telling his readers to learn more facts. He is telling them to know a person more deeply, which is precisely what he had spent 30 years doing. Notice what is absent from this final instruction. There is no strategy, no warning about a specific heresy, though he has spent a chapter on false teachers. No organizational advice for the church he was leaving, no arrangements. A dying apostle with one sentence left says, keep growing in grace and keep getting to know him better. Everything in both letters funnels into this. The living hope, the refining fire, the holiness, the submission, the suffering, the casting of anxiety, the humility, the promises, the staircase of virtue. All of it is the description of a person doing these 2 things over a long period. To him be glory both now and forever. Amen. Peter ends where he began his first letter, with worship, not with an exhortation, not with a farewell to his readers, but with glory directed at Christ. The last recorded act of the fisherman from Bethsaida is to give glory to the man who called him off the shore. And that is where he leaves us. Not with the finished product, but with a direction. Keep growing, keep knowing. The rest, he would say, is grace. A letter to the one who is certain. They have failed too badly. We want to stop here before we close and speak directly, not to everyone watching, but to one person. You know who you are. You have been listening to a study about a man who was restored, and something in you has been quietly insisting the whole time that his story is not available to you. That Peter was an apostle, that his failure happened before the resurrection, that there were reasons his restoration worked which do not apply to yours. You have your own list. The specific thing you did, the thing you keep doing, the season when you knew better and did it anyway, the person you hurt who has not forgiven you and may never, the years you cannot get back. And underneath it all is a conviction you have probably never said aloud, because saying it aloud would make it real, that you have used up whatever allowance there was, that God has not left exactly, but that something has cooled. that you are being tolerated rather than wanted. We want to speak to that as plainly and as gently as we know how. Peter denied Jesus 3 times with oaths to a servant girl and a group of strangers, while the man he had sworn to die for was being tried a courtyard away. He did it after being warned it would happen. He did it after insisting loudly that it would not. And it was not a private failure. It went into all 4 Gospels, read aloud in churches, preserved for 2,000 years, permanently attached to his name. And then, on a beach, the risen Christ made him breakfast. Not a lecture, not probation. Breakfast, charcoal fire, fish, bread, and a conversation in which Jesus asked him 3 times whether he loved him, once for each denial, and then gave him work to do. Feed my sheep. The restoration was not an amnesty that let Peter quietly remain in the group. It was a commission. He was not merely forgiven, he was put back to work and given more responsibility than he had before he fell. That is the pattern. That is what this God does with failure. He does not merely absorb it, he builds with it. And notice this, every teaching in this study is more credible because Peter failed. When he writes about humility, he is not speculating. When he tells you to arm your mind in advance, he knows what happens when you do not. When he says God gives grace to the humble, he is describing the mechanism by which he himself was rebuilt. The failure did not disqualify him from the ministry. In a strange and merciful way, it qualified him for it. So hear this if you hear nothing else today. You are not too far along. You are not the exception. You are not the one case where the blood was insufficient, the promises do not apply, and the shepherd does not come out looking. The whole letter you have just spent hours in was written by a man who had been where you are and was carried back. Sheep do not find their own way home. They are found and lifted and carried. That is not a lower form of return. That is the only kind there has ever been. Closing. What the fisherman left us. 42 teachings. We have walked all of them, and it is worth standing back for a moment to see the shape of what Peter built. He began with a living hope and ended with growth in grace, and everything between those 2 points is the description of a life lived under pressure without collapsing. He told us who we are before he told us what to do. He gave us an inheritance that cannot be reached, a garrison that cannot be breached, and a shepherd who does the finding. He told us to gird up our minds, to arm them in advance, to stay clear-headed in a loud world. He told us to love without masks and at full stretch, to cover the small offenses rather than collect them, to open our doors without keeping accounts. He told us to bless the people who revile us because we can afford to. He told us to tie on the apron, to get low, and to let grace run downhill to us. He told us to throw our anxiety at God because we matter to him. And he told us, having been through fire himself, that after we have suffered a while, we will be mended, established, strengthened, and settled. None of it is theory. Every line of it came out of a life that had been tested to destruction and had held. Remember how he started. A fisherman on the northern shore of a lake, hands ruined by rope, no education anyone valued, no standing, no reason for anyone to remember his name. Jesus looked at that man and called him Rock decades before there was any evidence for it, and then spent 3 years, 1 failure, 1 beach, 1 Pentecost, and 30 years of hard ministry making the name true. That is what he does. He names things before they are true and then makes them true. He did it with Peter. He is doing it with you. If this study has landed anywhere in you today, we want to ask you to do one thing before you go, and it is not for us. Send this video to one person. You already know who. Somewhere in these last hours a face came to mind, probably more than once. The friend who is in the fire right now and cannot see the end of it. The person carrying an anxiety they cannot put down. The one who is convinced they have failed past the point of return and has stopped coming to church because of it. the family member who is waiting on a promise that has taken years longer than they expected. Send it to them. You do not need to write an explanation or find the right words to go with it. You will not get credit for it, and you may never know what it did. That is exactly what makes it an act of love rather than a favor. Peter spent his life carrying words to people he thought needed them, and every one of us who has ever heard the gospel is downstream of somebody who did that. Be that for one person tonight. And if you have not subscribed yet, do that too. It is free, it is one tap, and it means you will be here for what comes next. Before you go, leave a comment and tell us which line or which verse in this study was the one you most needed to hear. Not the one you thought was most interesting. The one that landed somewhere real. There is something powerful about naming it, and there is something more powerful about the person scrolling past who reads your comment and realizes they needed that same line and did not know it until they saw someone else say it out loud. And now, our blessing over you. May the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ Jesus, mend what has been torn in you, and establish what has been shaken, and strengthen what has grown weak, and settle you on ground that will hold for the rest of your life. May you cast every anxiety on him tonight and find that he was carrying it before you let go. May you be kept, garrisoned, watched over, guarded by a power that is not your own, until the day your inheritance is placed in your hands. And may the shepherd and overseer of your soul, who has never once lost a sheep he went out after, hold you close through every fire and bring you home. God bless you. From wherever in the world you are watching this, grow in grace. We will see you in the next teaching.